Picture this. It's the Renaissance. The Black Death is finally in the rearview mirror, sort of. Art is exploding out of every fresco, and people are rediscovering both the works of Plato and the art of making their hairline look like it retreated on purpose. But most importantly, Europe is buzzing with a brand new obsession: romance. Not the movie kind, mind you, where awkward glances over coffee turn into true love. No, Renaissance romance was more like a mix of politics, poetry, and high-stakes chess. Marriages weren't usually about falling in love. They were about forging alliances, expanding family wealth, or securing land. In other words, your soulmate was chosen not by Cupid, but by a family accountant with a sharp quill and an eye for property lines. Yet, despite these practical arrangements, people were utterly fascinated with the idea of love. Courtly love, a leftover from the medieval troubadours, was still alive, except now it had been rebooted with a Renaissance flair, polished sonnets, lavish masquerades, and music that could melt even the most suspicious dowager's heart. Love became an art form, something to be studied, written about, and if necessary bribed into existence with some creative herbal assistance. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Think of it like this. Marriage was the serious business merger, but romantic love was the exciting side hustle. You might be married to a baron's daughter, but you'd still sneak glances at the lady across the banquet hall who dropped her lace handkerchief just so. And yes, that was the Renaissance version of a flirty text message, strategically dropping cloth on the floor and hoping someone noticed. Of course, love in this period came with strict rules of etiquette. Young nobles studied manuals on courtly behavior, learning things like never slurp your wine, don't insult your rival's wig, and if you're going to serenade beneath someone's balcony, at least stay in tune. Renaissance dating apps didn't exist, so instead you just hoped your lute playing was seductive enough to outweigh the smell of chamber pots wafting through the street. Beauty standards were equally intense. Fair skin was prized because it proved you weren't out working in the sun, and high foreheads were the thing. Women literally plucked their hairlines back to achieve the perfect look. Imagine a woman in Florence thinking, yes, rip out half my eyebrows. Nothing says desirable like a forehead the size of a dining table. Men, meanwhile, tried to look dashing with colourful tights, padded codpieces, and enough perfume to stun a horse. But here's the catch. With all this obsession over appearances and proper romance, many people found reality disappointing. Your arranged spouse might have bad teeth or worse, no appreciation for poetry. Enter the demand for shortcuts. And by shortcuts I mean love potions, because when your lute strumming, hairline plucking, codpiece fluffing routine still didn't seal the deal, you could always turn to the apothecary and say, yes, give me something that makes her heart race, preferably without killing me in the process. And so the Renaissance became not just the age of great art, scientific discoveries and political intrigue, but also the golden age of suspicious liquids in fancy bottles. Behind every painting of Venus and every courtly ballad whispered under candlelight, there was a very real question lingering: how much of this is true love, and how much of this is ground-up beetle wings mixed with wine? Because make no mistake, people wanted love, they wanted passion, and they wanted it now. If the gods wouldn't help, and Cupid was busy elsewhere, there was always chemistry. Sometimes it was just honey and cinnamon, other times it was toxic nightshade. The good news? You might win someone's affection. The bad news? You might also hallucinate that a goat was serenading you back. The Renaissance was an era where the boundaries between science, magic, and sheer wishful thinking were paper-thin. Alchemists promised to turn lead into gold. Doctors promised to balance your humors with leeches, and potion makers promised you'd finally get that aloof nobleman to notice you. And when the heart was on the line, who cared if the recipe involved powdered frog bones? So as we set the stage, remember this: Renaissance romance was high drama, mixed with perfume, poetry, and politics. Falling in love could be as risky as going to war, and just as expensive. And when charm failed, people turned to the mysterious world of love potions, bizarre, dangerous, and occasionally successful. After all, in a world where appearances meant everything, you had to stack the odds in your favor, even if it meant drinking something that smelled like a compost heap. If you've ever had a crush that didn't notice you, you probably know the feeling. If only there were a magic shortcut. In the Renaissance, people weren't just daydreaming about that possibility. They were investing time, money, and occasionally their digestive safety into it. Love potions didn't come out of nowhere. They grew from a stew of beliefs in magic, humors, alchemy, and desperation. And desperation, as history proves, is one of the most powerful forces in human invention. Let's start with the big one, magic. The Renaissance was an age obsessed with knowledge, but knowledge in that era meant Aristotle, Galen, and a healthy serving of spells and astrology. People believed the world was brimming with hidden connections, cosmic threads tying your body, the stars, plants, and even the moods of your liver together. If Mars and Venus were aligned, your love life would prosper. If Saturn glared down at you, prepare for loneliness and maybe gout. Magic wasn't something on the fringes. It was woven into medicine, farming, and romance. If you wanted your cabbage patch to thrive, you might bury a charm under the soil. If you wanted your beloved to notice you, why not slip them a potion blessed under the right moon? Same logic. And then came the theory of humors, the 4 bodily fluids that allegedly governed your personality and health: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. It sounds like a medieval grocery list, but Renaissance doctors swore by it. Too much black bile? You were melancholic. Too much blood? Passionate, maybe reckless. A love potion was supposed to rebalance these fluids so that desire could bloom. Imagine going to a doctor and saying, "She doesn't love me." His response? Yes, clearly your phlegm levels are inadequate. It wasn't nonsense to them, it was science, and this pseudoscience was the perfect soil for potions. If the body was just a system of fluids, then the right mixture of herbs, minerals, or animal parts could nudge those fluids toward passion. Think of it as the Renaissance version of hacking the algorithm, but magic and humors weren't the only reasons. Enter the alchemy craze. Alchemists were the Renaissance equivalent of startup founders. They promised miraculous transformations. They burned through lots of resources, and most of them failed spectacularly. While their big dream was turning lead into gold, alchemists also claimed they could brew elixirs of immortality, health, or yes, love. Their workshops reeked of boiling metals, crushed herbs, and possibly singed eyebrows. They were equal parts scientist, philosopher, and con artist, and for a small fee they were happy to whip up something that would ignite the flames of affection in your chosen target. Here's the thing, love potions weren't just about lust or attraction, they filled a social need. The Renaissance was a world of arranged marriages, rigid hierarchies, and limited mobility. Your family might decide who you married, but they couldn't decide who you actually liked. That tension between passion and practicality created a booming demand for any tool that might bend reality to your desires. A love potion was rebellion in liquid form. It was the promise that you could beat the system, that your feelings mattered, even if society thought otherwise. And of course, there's the human element, hope. Hope is a powerful drug, sometimes more effective than the potions themselves. Imagine being a lovelorn teenager in Florence, convinced that one sip of an herbal brew could finally make that dazzling merchant's daughter notice you. The mere belief gave you courage. The placebo effect has been alive and well since long before clinical trials. Now let's sprinkle in some humor here, because while this all sounds dramatic, it was often ridiculous. Renaissance folks didn't just believe in subtle influences, they believed in direct, often messy magic. If you couldn't win someone with charm, you tried chemistry. Literally. Didn't matter if the chemistry involved honey, ground beetles, or substances that smelled like your neighbor's latrine. If it came in a bottle and someone whispered it was enchanted, you were in. After all, "You never know until you try" is a phrase that has doomed humanity to many questionable dinners, and in this case, many questionable drinks. And then there's the darker side. Some potions were risky precisely because they played on those desperate hopes. Unscrupulous sellers could pass off anything as a love potion. Stale wine, love potion; colored water, love potion; crushed chalk mixed with wine vinegar. Oh yes, very powerful. Guaranteed results. The result was a thriving industry of tricksters who made a good living from heartbreak. But even the real recipes, those based on humors or alchemy, sometimes worked, though not for the reasons intended. A potion laced with alcohol might lower inhibitions, making both parties friendlier. A mix with stimulating spices like cinnamon or ginger could raise body temperature, tricking someone into thinking passion had taken hold. The Renaissance believer thought it was magic. In reality, it was chemistry, psychology, and maybe a little tipsy optimism. So why did love potions exist? Because the Renaissance was an age of contradictions. It was logical and mystical, scientific and superstitious, practical and wildly hopeful. People turned to potions because love is messy, society was rigid, and the human heart has never been particularly patient. You could write sonnets, pluck your hairline, or strum your lute, but sometimes you just wanted to drink your way into a happy ending. The good news: many people truly believed they'd found a shortcut to love. The bad news: sometimes the shortcut led straight to stomach cramps. Step into a Renaissance apothecary's shop, and you'll instantly know you're not in your local pharmacy. Forget neat rows of pill bottles and fluorescent lighting. Instead, picture shelves stacked with jars of dried plants, bundles of herbs dangling from beams, and animal bones that may or may not be labeled. The air is a cocktail of spices, musk, and mystery. You're not entirely sure whether you're about to be cured, bewitched, or robbed, but either way, it's an experience. The apothecary was a cornerstone of Renaissance society. In theory, their role was clear. They provided medicines, but medicine back then was a much looser category than today. Alongside remedies for headaches or stomach cramps, apothecaries sold powders for fertility, concoctions for stamina, and yes, potions to inspire love. Their shop was equal parts healthcare provider, curiosity cabinet, and rumor mill. Let's break down what made them fascinating. The shop itself was like stepping into a living encyclopedia of natural and not-so-natural wonders. Baskets of dried rose petals sat beside vials of powdered horn. Shelves were lined with glass jars holding everything from saffron threads to something disturbingly labeled pulvis toad. Behind the counter, mortars and pestles were worn smooth from years of grinding. An apothecary might look like a humble tradesman, but he was often half doctor, half wizard, half scam artist. Yes, Renaissance math was flexible. He had enough knowledge of herbs to seem legitimate, enough mysterious flair to seem magical, and enough business savvy to charge handsomely for both. Apothecaries served a wide clientele. Nobles came looking for exotic imports, ambergris, frankincense, cinnamon, ingredients that screamed wealth and status. Middle-class merchants might ask for a strengthening tonic before a big negotiation, read flavored wine. And then there were the lovesick youths, clutching a few coins and whispering, "Do you have something to make her notice me?" For the apothecary, this was a dream. Love potions required no guarantees. If the potion worked, he got credit. If it failed, clearly the stars were misaligned, or the drinker hadn't been pure enough in spirit. Either way, no refunds. Apothecaries drew from a vast menu of ingredients, some quite sensible, others straight out of a nightmare. On the reasonable end, you had rosemary, lavender, honey, and cinnamon, all herbs with pleasant smells and mild effects. On the bizarre end, you had powdered frog, dried beetles, or shavings of a stag's antlers. Some recipes even suggested adding ground-up gemstones, which was less about science and more about showing off. The logic: if it was rare, hard to get, or just plain weird, it must be powerful. Renaissance thinking often blurred the line between medicine and magic. A pinch of nutmeg might warm the blood, while a dash of powdered lizard tail was supposed to stimulate desire, or at least stimulate questions like, why does my wine taste like swamp? A good apothecary wasn't just a mixer of ingredients, he was a performer. When selling a love potion, he might lower his voice, lean across the counter and whisper the secret recipe. He might wave a sprig of herbs like a wand or mutter a few words in Latin to give the moment gravitas. Theatrics mattered as much as the potion itself. Customers weren't just buying a drink, they were buying the hope, the ritual, the sense of participating in something mystical. And if the apothecary looked a bit like he belonged in the background of a wizard's painting, all the better. Apothecaries had to tread carefully. On one hand, they were respected as healers, sometimes consulted by physicians for their practical knowledge of herbs. On the other, their trade in mysterious powders and whispered cures made them prime suspects for accusations of witchcraft or fraud. Too successful, and people might mutter that you had the devil's help. Too unsuccessful, and they'd just call you a crook. It was a delicate balance. Provide just enough real medicine to maintain respectability, while keeping the love potions strange enough to seem magical. Why did apothecaries become central to the love potion trade? Simple. They had the supply chain. They were connected to spice merchants, herbalists, and traveling traders. They could source cinnamon from the east, cacao from the New World, or dried mandrake root from the local hedge witch. If you wanted something rare, dangerous, or smelly, the apothecary was your guy. And love was good business. Unlike remedies for headaches or toothaches, love potions tapped into endless demand. Headaches come and go, toothaches eventually get pulled. But romance? Romance sells every day of the year. From a modern perspective, the apothecary's shop was equal parts wonder and comedy. Imagine walking in with lovesickness and walking out with a vial of rosewater mixed with, wait for it, crushed beetles. Did it work? Probably not. But the placebo effect is strong, and a love-struck mind doesn't ask too many questions. If you were lucky, you got something harmless, maybe even tasty. If you were unlucky, you ended up with stomach cramps and an empty purse. Either way, the apothecary got paid. The Renaissance apothecary's shop was truly a theatre of the bizarre, where science, superstition, and capitalism collided. It was a place of wonder, of hope, and of suspicious animal bits that really had no business being in a drink. But to the desperate it was worth it. After all, if Cupid wasn't answering your prayers, the apothecary always had something in a bottle. Every era has its so-called sexy foods. Today, people joke about strawberries, chocolate, or maybe champagne. In the Renaissance, however, the list of love-inducing ingredients was, let's just say, eclectic. If it smelled bad or wriggled, chances are someone thought it was romantic. Forget candle-lit dinners. This was the age of oysters, honey, saffron, and even ambergris, a substance that literally came out of a whale's digestive system. Yes, love was glamorous, but sometimes it smelled faintly of low tide. Let's start with the obvious headliner. Oysters. They've been linked to love and fertility since antiquity, and the Renaissance carried on the tradition with enthusiasm. Why? For one, they were associated with Venus, the goddess of love, who supposedly emerged from the sea on a shell. And two, well, they looked suggestive. Humans have never been subtle when making symbolic connections. In Renaissance banquets, oysters were served as a prelude to romance. Nobles slurped them down not just for the taste, briny and fresh, but for the symbolism. And conveniently, oysters actually are high in zinc, which does boost certain bodily functions. So in this rare case, the superstition had a tiny nugget of truth. Of course, nothing kills the mood like a bad oyster. For every noble couple gazing at each other over a plate, there was someone in the corner regretting their life choices and praying to every saint in the calendar. Next up, saffron, the most expensive spice of the Renaissance. Its golden threads were worth their weight in, well, gold, and it wasn't just prized for cooking. People believed saffron warmed the body and inflamed passion. A little in your stew could supposedly ignite the fire of love. Beyond its cost, saffron carried an aura of luxury and exoticism. It came from faraway lands, and consuming it was a statement. I am wealthy, refined, and about to sweep you off your feet. There are accounts of saffron being used in perfumes, wines, and even bedchamber linens. Did it work? Possibly, in the sense that anyone impressed by your ability to spend a fortune on spices might be more inclined to swoon. Honey, the universal symbol of sweetness, was another Renaissance favorite. It had been celebrated since ancient times as both a food and a medicine, and in matters of love, it symbolized fertility, attraction, and sweetness in the relationship. Honeymoons, literally named for the tradition of drinking honeyed wine after a wedding, were thought to help ensure a fruitful marriage. But honey wasn't just symbolic, it was practical. It masked the taste of less appetizing ingredients in potions. Imagine being handed a cup that contained powdered beetle wing and frog bits. Would you drink it? No. Add honey. Suddenly, it's at least tolerable. So honey became the great romantic disguise. Love's spoonful of sugar to help the frog powder go down. Now let's get weird. Ambergris. This was a rare substance produced in the intestines of sperm whales, washed ashore in waxy lumps that smelled strange. To the Renaissance apothecary, ambergris was liquid gold. It was rare, exotic, and rumored to heighten desire. Wealthy nobles sprinkled it in their wine, perfumes, and even medicines. Why? Partly because it was thought to warm the body and spirit. Partly because anything that rare had to be magical. If you could afford whale vomit in your potion, you were clearly operating on a higher romantic tier than the peasant mixing parsley in their ale. Ambergris was also a key ingredient in perfumes. Mixed with musk and rosewater, it provided a lingering scent. Nothing says romantic evening like smelling faintly of whale innards and roses. The Renaissance aphrodisiac cabinet didn't stop there. Almonds were believed to stir passion, maybe because they were expensive and exotic. Truffles, the fungi, not the chocolates, were prized for their rarity and musky aroma, which some compared to the scent of desire itself. Quail eggs had a reputation for boosting virility, leading to the unfortunate image of someone downing half a dozen eggs before heading off to woo their beloved. Sparrow brains occasionally popped up in recipes, because nothing says true love like bird neurology. The list went on: basil, ginger, cinnamon, even artichokes. If it made the body warm, tingly, or even mildly gassy, someone somewhere declared it an aphrodisiac. Aphrodisiacs weren't always consumed in secret potions. Often, they were part of lavish meals. Picture a Renaissance banquet: long tables, roasted peacocks with gilded feathers, trays of oysters, sweetmeats drenched in honey, saffron rice glowing like gold. Eating itself was part of the seduction, the sensory experience, the performance. To feed someone honeyed almonds was both a gesture of love and a subtle suggestion. And let's not forget the psychological side. If you're told a food is an aphrodisiac, chances are you'll feel at least a little different after eating it. Placebo is powerful. Combine that with candlelight, music, and maybe a little too much spiced wine, and suddenly the oysters do seem to be working. Looking back, the Renaissance pantry of passion is a mixture of romance and comedy. Oysters, saffron, and honey make sense. They're delicious, luxurious, and indulgent. Ambergris, less so. It's as if someone found a random lump on the beach, sniffed it, and declared, "Yes, this will definitely make her love me." And everyone else nodded. It reveals something timeless about humanity. The lengths we'll go to find a shortcut to love, whether slurping down oysters, splurging on saffron, or sipping whale perfume. People were willing to gamble their wallets and occasionally their stomachs for a shot at romance. So the next time you see oysters on a menu, or a honey-drizzled dessert, remember, in the Renaissance, these weren't just foods. They were weapons in the eternal battle for affection. Some worked, some didn't, but all of them tell us that when it comes to love, humans have always been willing to eat some truly questionable things. If love potions of the Renaissance had a luxury tier, it was stocked not with parsley from the garden or honey from the hive, but with treasures hauled across oceans and deserts. This was the age of exploration, when caravans trudged overland and ships braved storms to bring back goods from the East and the New World. And while kings and merchants justified these journeys in the name of trade and empire, let's be honest, Half the cinnamon ended up in some hopeful noble's love elixir, because nothing says passion like bankrupting yourself for cinnamon. Spices were at the heart of this exotic affair. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, pepper, all carried reputations for heating the body, stirring the blood, and loosening inhibitions. Europeans didn't just crave them for their taste, they believed spices carried the fire of the tropics themselves. Sprinkle cinnamon in a drink, and you weren't just adding flavor, you were importing the heat of faraway lands, the mystery of the unknown, and maybe, if you were lucky, a little romantic sizzle. Of course, the price tags were equally hot. A pouch of nutmeg could cost as much as a worker's monthly wages, so offering it in a potion was both an aphrodisiac and a flex. Nothing wooed like "I can afford to set fire to my savings on imported tree bark." Then there was cacao, the New World's contribution to Europe's love toolkit. When it first arrived from Mesoamerica, it was bitter, spiced with chili, and worlds apart from the sweet chocolate we know today. Europeans quickly reworked it with sugar, cinnamon, and honey, transforming it into a rich drink that courtiers whispered had aphrodisiac powers. Drinking cacao wasn't just indulgence, it was performance. Imagine sitting in a candlelit room, sipping a steaming exotic beverage while murmuring about passion and destiny. Even if the chemistry didn't do much, the theatre of it all carried its own charge. After all, if your date is impressed that you can source cacao in Renaissance Florence, the potion has already worked. Amber, cardamom, and exotic gums like mastic also found their way into these concoctions. They came from far-off places like Arabia, India, or the Levant, wrapped in mystique and travel tales. The mere mention of their origins lent them power. What better way to prove your love than to present something that had crossed mountains and seas to reach you? These weren't just ingredients, they were miniature adventures in a jar, and nothing heightened a potion's allure like the sense that it contained the essence of distant, magical lands. Of course, luxury carried risks. The exotic goods trade was notorious for fraud. That cinnamon you bought might just be bark dyed to look the part. The saffron threads could be marigold petals painted yellow. An apothecary had to know his sources, or at least put on a convincing act while selling you parsley at the price of cloves. The lovesick customer, meanwhile, rarely questioned the authenticity. If you're desperate enough to believe whale vomit can make someone fall for you, you won't stop to examine whether your cinnamon smells suspiciously like the neighbor's firewood. And then there's the economic angle. The exotic ingredient craze fueled entire empires. The Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and later the English all fought for control of spice routes. Wars were waged, fortunes made and lost, and ships sunk, all to control the cinnamon, nutmeg, and pepper trade. In a strange way, love potions were tangled up in global politics. The noble in Paris who sprinkled nutmeg into his mistress's wine was, unknowingly, part of an international struggle that left sailors dead and kingdoms richer. It was globalization with a side of seduction. The humor in all this is almost too easy. Picture a love-struck Venetian merchant throwing down his purse for a vial of cloves, convinced it will win him a lady's heart, while in the background, an entire empire is collapsing under the cost of maintaining spice routes. Love might make you do foolish things, but in the Renaissance it could also bankrupt nations. If that's not passion, I don't know what is. What's fascinating is how these exotic imports blurred the line between potion and luxury gift. Sometimes they weren't even mixed into a drink. They were simply given as tokens of affection. A pouch of saffron, a box of candied ginger, or a flask of spiced chocolate could serve as a declaration of desire. The gift itself became a potion, a symbol of wealth, longing and connection to a wider world. It wasn't just "I love you," it was "I love you enough to import half of India." And so, in the great marketplace of Renaissance romance, exotic imports became the jewels of the love potion trade. They were expensive, mysterious, and often more effective as status symbols than as actual stimulants. Did cinnamon really inflame the passions? Did cacao stir the heart? Science might shrug, but the effect was undeniable. These ingredients enchanted because they represented possibility, the hope that love could be bought, bottled, and delivered from across the seas. In the end, That's what made exotic imports so irresistible. They weren't just spices or drinks, they were dreams disguised as flavor, and when it came to love, dreams were worth every coin. If you think modern dating is complicated, with its apps, algorithms, and endless what's your star sign icebreakers, spare a thought for the Renaissance. Back then, astrology wasn't just a conversation starter, it was the rulebook for life. And when it came to love potions, the stars mattered just as much as the ingredients. In fact, for many potion makers, the real recipe began not with herbs, but with the heavens. If Mercury was in retrograde, so was your love life. Astrology in the Renaissance wasn't a fringe hobby. It was mainstream science endorsed by scholars, doctors, and even kings. Universities taught astrology alongside medicine because the two were considered inseparable. Your body was thought to be influenced by the same forces that govern the heavens. If Mars could dictate the tides of war and Saturn could bring melancholy, surely Venus could inspire desire. Thus, any apothecary worth his salt or cinnamon kept an eye on the stars. Potion making often began with a horoscope. If a client wanted a drink to attract someone, the apothecary might ask for the target's birth date, then consult his tables of planetary alignments. Was Venus strong in the chart? Excellent. The love potion would flow smoothly. Was Saturn looming nearby? Uh-oh. Better add extra saffron and say a prayer. The apothecary might even time the brewing of the potion to coincide with auspicious planetary hours. A few hours difference could mean the difference between eternal devotion and indigestion. The stars weren't just background decoration, they were treated as ingredients in their own right. Venus and Mars were the celebrity sponsors of Renaissance passion. Venus, planet of love and beauty, was said to imbue potions with charm and allure. Mars, fiery and warlike, gave them heat and vigor. Put the two together in favorable alignment, and you had the cosmic equivalent of chocolate and roses. But if Venus was in opposition to Saturn, forget it. Your potion might just produce sulking, jealousy, or the sudden urge to join a monastery. Astrologers published guides on when to pick herbs based on lunar cycles. Chamomile harvested under a waxing moon was thought to be more potent. Rose petals plucked on a Friday, the day of Venus, carried her blessing. Even water mattered. Some insisted potions had to be mixed with rainwater collected during particular planetary hours. Imagine explaining to a customer, "Sorry, I can't make your potion today. The moon's in Scorpio and the rainwater I collected last week just isn't romantic enough." Astrology also helped explain why love potions sometimes failed. If the object of affection didn't fall for you, clearly it wasn't the potion's fault, it was the stars. Your Venus is afflicted by Saturn was the Renaissance equivalent of she's just not that into you. In this way, astrology became a convenient safety net for potion peddlers. No refunds necessary, blame the cosmos, and let's not underestimate the psychological power of it all. Imagine being told that the heavens themselves had aligned to support your romance. Suddenly, you're not just drinking wine spiced with herbs, you're drinking destiny. That belief gave people confidence, and confidence, as any modern dating coach will tell you, can be just as effective as any potion. The humor, of course, is easy to spot in hindsight. Picture a lovesick nobleman pacing while his apothecary squints at a star chart, muttering, "Ah yes, Jupiter is in the house of Leo, which means she'll definitely notice you if you wear green." Or the astrologer solemnly advising a young woman, "Do not drink this potion until Venus clears the horizon, unless you want him to fall in love with your sister instead." Romance wasn't just a gamble, it was celestial roulette. Astrology's influence reached far beyond personal potions. Entire courtships were planned around it. A king might consult astrologers before arranging a marriage, making sure the union had heavenly approval. And when rumors spread of illicit affairs, astrology was often dragged into the gossip. Oh, she didn't betray him. Mercury was retrograde. It was the perfect excuse, one that conveniently shifted responsibility from human weakness to planetary mischief. Even alchemists, with their bubbling experiments, leaned on astrology. They believed metals and planets were linked, gold with the sun, silver with the moon, copper with Venus. If you added copper shavings to a potion, it wasn't just because it glittered. It was because Venus herself was lending a hand. A sprinkle of metal dust, a nod to the stars, and suddenly your love potion carried cosmic authority. And yet, for all its absurdities, astrology offered something comforting. In a world of arranged marriages, strict hierarchies, and unpredictable diseases, the stars provided a sense of order. They told people that love wasn't random, it was written. That comfort was worth its weight in ambergris. After all, it's easier to hope when you think the universe is conspiring in your favor. So when you imagine Renaissance lovers, don't just think of candlelit banquets and whispered poetry. Picture them nervously asking, "Is tonight a good night to confess my feelings? Or should I wait until Venus is in Pisces?" Their romances weren't just earthly affairs, they were cosmic events, mapped out on parchment charts filled with strange symbols. And so the role of astrology in love potions was less about science and more about storytelling. It gave structure, hope, and a dash of drama. It transformed a cup of spiced wine into a ritual aligned with the heavens, and if it didn't work, well, blame Saturn. He's always ruining the fun. If Renaissance love potions already seemed strange with their saffron threads and honey drizzles, brace yourself. Because when humans ran out of herbs and spices, they turned to the animal kingdom with enthusiasm and very little restraint. Frogs, beetles, deer antlers, lizards, and more found themselves pulverized, boiled, or bottled in the pursuit of romance. Apparently nothing makes you irresistible like smelling faintly of lizard. Animal ingredients weren't chosen at random. Renaissance thinkers believed in what's called the doctrine of signatures, the idea that a plant or animal's appearance or behavior hinted at its hidden powers. A plant shaped like a heart must be good for the heart. An animal with vigorous mating habits, surely it could transfer its passion to you. Thus creatures became symbols to be ingested, rubbed, or burned as incense. The frog might croak at night, the beetle might burrow tirelessly, the stag might fight ferociously for its mate. Humans looked at all of that and thought, yes, let's put that in a cup. Take the frog, for example. In many regions, frogs were dried, ground into powder, and added to wine or ale. Why frogs? They lived in water and on land. Liminal creatures thought to connect different realms. They were also prolific breeders, which made them natural symbols of fertility. Never mind that a powdered frog turned your drink into something closer to a dare than a date night enhancer. The symbolism was enough. If you wanted a child, if you wanted passion, you'd drink your amphibian cocktail and hope for the best. Beetles were another popular choice, particularly the Spanish fly, or cantharides. Apothecaries crushed the dried beetles into a powder that was said to inflame desire. In reality, cantharidin, the compound they contain, is highly toxic. It can cause blisters, burning sensations, and organ failure. So yes, technically it got your blood pumping, just not in the way you wanted. Despite the danger, Spanish fly enjoyed a scandalous reputation all the way into the modern era, a kind of forbidden love drug. Renaissance buyers might not have known the chemistry, but they were certainly willing to risk agony for a shot at passion. Then there were deer antlers. Powdered antler was thought to strengthen virility, perhaps because stags were admired for their strength, aggression, and annual regrowth of their antlers, a kind of symbolic renewal. If a stag could grow back weapons on its head every year, surely it could lend some of that energy to a struggling lover. Mixed into potions or sprinkled onto food, antler powder promised to imbue men with stag-like vigor. In reality, it mostly imbued them with the sense they'd been tricked into eating bone dust. Lizards and snakes occasionally slithered into recipes too. A lizard's tail could break off and regrow, so it symbolized resilience and vitality, traits any lover would want. Snakes, associated with transformation and forbidden temptation since biblical times, carried a dangerous allure. Some recipes advised burning their skins to ash and mixing the remains with wine. The result was probably less a seductive aroma and more the smell of a very bad barbecue. But again, symbolism mattered more than taste. Even birds contributed. Doves, sacred to Venus, were thought to embody love and fidelity. Occasionally, parts of doves' hearts' feathers were incorporated into brews. Sparrows, notorious for their relentless mating, lent their reputations to potions as well. A little powdered sparrow brain might be just what you needed to spark passion, if you could get past the fact that you were drinking powdered bird noggin. What ties all of this together is the Renaissance habit of looking to nature for clues. People lived close to animals, observed them constantly, and interpreted their behavior through a human lens. If an animal was lusty, strong, fertile, or regenerative, it became raw material for romance. And in a time when biology was still tangled up with mythology, no creature was too strange to be recruited. It's easy to laugh now, imagining a hopeful lover choking down frog powder or beetle dust. But there's a tragic humor in it too. These were people desperate for love in a rigid society, willing to endure unpleasant tastes and dangerous side effects for the chance of affection. If nothing else, the sheer creativity is impressive. Today's dating scene may involve bad apps and awkward dinners, but at least it rarely involves powdered amphibians. Of course, animal-based potions also carried risks beyond indigestion. They blurred the line between medicine and magic. Too much dabbling with strange animal parts could get you accused of witchcraft, especially if your potion worked a little too well. A suspicious neighbor might whisper, "She used frog bones to steal his heart." Suddenly your harmless experiment in romance could turn into a very public trial. Yet the animal ingredients persisted, century after century. They offered something herbs alone couldn't, a sense of raw power, of primal energy. A frog might be slimy, a beetle might be grotesque, but both were alive, animated, mysterious. Consuming them was a way of borrowing their vitality. And if you happened to smell faintly of lizard afterward, well, that was just the price of passion. So the next time you hear someone complain about the oddness of modern dating rituals, paying too much for coffee, rehearsing clever texts, agonizing over emojis, remember that Renaissance lovers sometimes gulped down powdered beetles and thought they were onto something. Suddenly Tinder doesn't look so bad. Love has always been intoxicating, but during the Renaissance it could be literally lethal. By now you've seen how apothecaries and hopeful lovers mixed herbs, spices, and the occasional amphibian into their brews. But some recipes went much darker, dabbling with ingredients that today we'd lock away under hazardous materials. Arsenic, mercury, and belladonna were just a few of the shining stars in this deadly lineup. The line between "I love you forever" and "please bury me at once" was razor thin. Why such dangerous choices? In part, it came down to visibility. Substances like arsenic and mercury had powerful, immediate effects on the body, so people assumed they were potent, just not always in the way they imagined. The Renaissance fascination with extremes played a role too. If a little cinnamon warmed the blood, then surely a splash of something violently toxic could supercharge passion. It's the same logic as pouring the entire salt shaker into your soup because a pinch tasted good. Arsenic was one of the most notorious offenders. Though often used in small amounts as a medicine for ailments ranging from skin problems to syphilis, it was also feared as a poison of choice for assassinations. In love potions it was slipped in under the belief that its stimulating properties could excite the body and awaken dormant desires. What it usually awakened, however, was violent illness. A lovesick nobleman might have ended up on his knees, but not in front of his beloved, more likely in front of a bucket. Arsenic was invisible in wine, which made it tempting to use, but the outcome was a coin toss between slightly flushed cheeks and "write my epitaph." Mercury had an equally slippery reputation. In alchemical circles, it was revered as a mystical element, liquid silver, the metal that flowed. Alchemists believed mercury represented transformation, fluidity, and the marriage of opposites, making it a perfect symbolic ingredient for love. Add a drop of mercury, they thought, and you were infusing your potion with the power of union itself. In practice, you were infusing it with heavy metal poisoning. Mercury exposure led to tremors, madness, and eventual death. The only passion it truly stirred was a frantic need to stop drinking anything an apothecary handed you. Belladonna, or deadly nightshade, might be the most infamous of them all. The name itself, beautiful woman, was tied to its cosmetic use. Women sometimes dripped its juice into their eyes to dilate their pupils. creating what was thought to be an alluring, doe-eyed look. Of course, it also blurred vision and could cause blindness, but beauty standards have never been known for their practicality. As a potion ingredient, belladonna was meant to stimulate the senses, arouse desire, and create a state of dreamy intoxication. Instead, it often caused delirium, hallucinations, and the occasional inconvenient death. Imagine trying to win someone's affection while they were convinced the walls were crawling with dancing goats. Not exactly the romantic evening you pictured. What's astonishing is how casually these poisons were handled. Apothecaries and alchemists were not ignorant of their dangers, but Renaissance medicine had a simple principle: the dose makes the poison. In tiny amounts, many toxins were thought to have therapeutic or stimulating effects. The problem, of course, was measuring. Precision scales weren't exactly standardized, and the line between a drop to warm the heart and a drop to stop the heart was hair-thin. Your apothecary might have steady hands, or he might have sneezed mid-measure. Either way, your romantic destiny depended on it. There are whispered stories of nobles and mistresses who overdid it. A lady in Florence might slip too much belladonna into her suitor's wine, expecting passion but delivering delirium. A jealous rival might accidentally spike a rival's potion with mercury, ensuring he spent the evening raving instead of romancing. The courts buzzed with rumors of lovers driven mad or poisoned under the guise of potions gone wrong. Love was always dangerous in the Renaissance, but add a pinch of arsenic and it became positively lethal. Yet people kept using them. Why? Because desperation outweighs caution. If you've already tried honey, oysters, and astrological timing with no success, the next step is often, fine, give me the really powerful stuff. These toxic ingredients carried an aura of forbidden power, the sense that if they could kill, surely they could also kindle. It was a gamble, and gamblers rarely focus on the odds. From our vantage point, it's both horrifying and darkly comedic. Imagine a Renaissance apothecary cheerfully telling his customer, "Yes, this one contains a little belladonna, just enough to make her heart race, hopefully not enough to make her see demons," or the hopeful young man sipping his potion, feeling flushed and dizzy, and thinking, love must be working. It wasn't love, it was arsenic, and the only sparks were in his nervous system. Still, these deadly ingredients show us something profound about Renaissance life. People lived with death all around them. Plagues, wars, and accidents were constant companions. In that world, risking a little arsenic for love didn't seem as outrageous as it does to us. If life was short, why not gamble? Better to burn brightly and briefly than never to spark at all. The real legacy of these dangerous doses isn't the number of people poisoned, but the reminder that the human longing for love is powerful enough to flirt with death itself. The Renaissance heart wanted what it wanted, even if it came with convulsions. Love may be universal, but the way people tried to bottle it in the Renaissance varied wildly depending on your social class. A peasant in a muddy village and a duchess in her perfumed chamber might both long for romance, but their tools, ingredients, and approaches to love potions couldn't have been more different. Your local farmer's daughter might slip you parsley, while the duke's mistress preferred pearls dissolved in vinegar. One was cheap and earthy, the other cost more than your annual harvest. Among the lower classes, love potions were rooted in practicality. Ingredients had to be cheap, available, and discreet. After all, you couldn't exactly ask the village apothecary for powdered unicorn horn when your family barely had bread. So peasant remedies leaned heavily on what could be found in fields, hedges, and kitchens. Parsley, basil, garlic, and onions were all pressed into service, not because they were luxurious, but because they were handy and carried symbolic associations. Basil, for example, was believed to kindle affection. Parsley had ties to fertility. If nothing else, they added a burst of flavor to otherwise bland meals, which may have been seductive enough on its own. Some folk brews were little more than soups or teas, steeped with herbs thought to carry love-drawing properties. A young woman might brew a tisane of marjoram or thyme, whispering charms over it before serving it to the object of her affection. Others relied on honeyed drinks, blending sweetness with symbolism. Folk traditions were less about dazzling displays and more about weaving magic into daily life. The potion might be crude, but the hope behind it was as refined as any sonnet written in a noble's court. Superstition also played a key role in village love magic. Simple charms, placing an apple under a lover's pillow, tying a lock of hair into a cloth pouch, or reciting verses while stirring a drink were just as important as the ingredients themselves. In communities where everyone knew everyone, secrecy mattered. A farmer's daughter couldn't flaunt her desires with costly saffron, but she could slip a sprig of rosemary into a cup and pray the gesture would go unnoticed until its effects mysteriously appeared. Contrast this with the courts of Europe, where nobles had access to wealth, exotic trade, and an entire industry of apothecaries eager to impress. Here, love potions became elaborate spectacles, dripping with rare and ostentatious ingredients. Why settle for parsley when you could crush pearls into vinegar, turning a gem into a liquid elixir of passion? Why offer a sprig of rosemary when you could present chocolate imported from across the ocean, spiced with cinnamon and sugar? For the elite, the potion wasn't just about love, it was about demonstrating wealth, power, and sophistication. Courtly mixtures often bordered on absurd. Recipes called for gold leaf, ambergris, musk, or saffron, each more expensive than the last. Some were so costly that they were as much status symbols as remedies. Drinking a potion laced with pearls wasn't about whether it worked. It was about proving you could afford to swallow jewelry without blinking. Imagine a duchess leaning coyly across a table. "Yes, my love, this goblet contains crushed gemstones. Try not to choke on our family fortune." The social contrast also showed in how these potions were consumed. In peasant communities, they were passed in humble mugs, shared at a hearth, often accompanied by nervous laughter and whispered hopes. In noble courts, they were served in gilded goblets at candlelit feasts, with musicians strumming lutes in the background. The setting itself became part of the potion, layering atmosphere and suggestion onto the drink. What's striking is that both worlds, despite their differences, shared a common impulse: the belief that love could be coaxed, manipulated, or hastened with a little outside help. The village girl with her parsley sprig and the noble woman with her pearl dust weren't so different at heart. They both hoped that mixing something into a drink could tilt fortune in their favor. One gambled with herbs, the other with treasure, but the stakes were the same: longing, desire, and the uncertainty of human affection. Of course, there was humor in both. Imagine a poor shepherd nervously sipping a potion flavored with garlic, his breath repelling the very girl he hoped to woo, or a duke gagging politely as he tried to down a goblet of vinegar and pulverized pearls, his stomach less stirred with love than with nausea. Romance in the Renaissance was rarely straightforward, and sometimes the potions worked more as comedy than chemistry. There's also a cultural irony here. Folk remedies, humble though they were, sometimes carried real medicinal effects. Herbs like basil, rosemary, and garlic do have stimulating or health-boosting properties. Meanwhile, the elite potions weighed down with pearls and gold leaf did little more than glitter expensively on the way down. In some ways, the farmer's daughter's parsley tea had a better chance of warming the heart than the duchess's gilded goblet of nonsense. Ultimately, this divide between folk and elite traditions paints a vivid picture of Renaissance society. Potions were not just about love, they were mirrors of class, wealth, and worldview. For the poor, potions were whispered hopes in the kitchen. For the rich, they were theatrical performances staged with spices and jewels. And yet, at the core, both reflected the same truth. Love made people do foolish, hopeful, and occasionally stomach-churning things. So whether you were drinking parsley broth in a peasant's hut or pearl vinegar in a Florentine palace, you were part of the same eternal story. Love was elusive, and people would try anything from humble herbs to luxury gems to bottle it. And if both left you queasy, well, at least you learnt something. Romance tastes expensive at court, but it tastes garlicky in the fields. If Renaissance apothecaries were brewing potions in backroom shops, Renaissance writers were brewing them on the page. Literature was obsessed with love, desire, and all the mischief that came with them. and nothing spiced up a story quite like a magical drink that made people fall head over heels. From Shakespeare's stages to Petrarch's sonnets to Boccaccio's tales, enchanted love was everywhere. It wasn't just entertainment, it reflected how deeply the idea of love potions had seeped into the Renaissance imagination. And yes, Romeo didn't need a love potion, just better judgment. Let's start with the obvious showman, William Shakespeare. Though writing at the tail end of the Renaissance, he tapped straight into the tradition of magical romance. His play A Midsummer Night's Dream is basically a love potion showcase. Puck squeezes the juice of a flower called love in idleness onto unsuspecting eyelids, causing chaos as characters fall madly in love with the wrong people. At one point, Titania, queen of the fairies, wakes up and swoons over Bottom, who has inconveniently been transformed into a man with a donkey's head. Nothing says romance like falling for a guy whose best feature is his braying. The comedy worked because audiences already believed in the power of enchanted substances. Shakespeare didn't invent the trope, he just turned it into brilliant farce. And then there's Romeo and Juliet. Technically, there are no love potions here, just youthful impulsivity and terrible decision-making. But audiences at the time would have been keenly aware of the love potion tradition, and Juliet's sleeping draught echoes it. Though meant to mimic death, the potion carries the same sense of magical intervention in matters of love. The play demonstrates what Renaissance audiences already suspected. Potions might meddle with fate, but the results were rarely what you expected. Romeo didn't need a potion to fall in love with Juliet. He needed a calendar reminding him that maybe falling for someone at first glance and planning marriage in under 24 hours wasn't the wisest strategy. Before Shakespeare, Italian writers were already weaving magical love into their stories. Boccaccio, in his Decameron, told a wide range of tales about passion, trickery, and the extremes people went to in pursuit of romance. While not every story included potions, the theme of manipulated desire ran throughout. Characters slipped powders or strange concoctions into drinks, hoping to win or control their lovers. These tales reflected real fears and fantasies of the time. That desire could be engineered, tampered with, and used as a weapon. To a Renaissance audience, this wasn't just fiction, it was plausible gossip dressed up as entertainment. Petrarch, the poet who practically invented modern love poetry, leaned less on magical potions and more on the intoxicating power of emotion itself. His sonnets to Laura are steeped in longing, obsession, and the idea that love is a kind of enchantment in its own right. While Petrarch didn't write about bubbling cauldrons or frog powders, his work contributed to the atmosphere that made people receptive to the idea of magic in romance. Love, whether caused by a glance or a potion, was portrayed as overwhelming, irrational, and transformative. It didn't need chemicals to feel like sorcery. Beyond the heavy hitters, love potions trickled into countless ballads, morality tales, and folklore collections. Stories warned of women who ensnared men with enchanted drinks, or men who dosed unsuspecting brides to ensure loyalty. Sometimes these tales ended happily, love secured, marriages formed. Other times, they spiraled into tragedy, with jealousy, poisonings, or divine punishments. The moral was clear: meddle with desire at your own risk. Literature mirrored the double-edged reality of real potions. They could be a symbol of romance or a recipe for disaster. Humor was never far from these depictions. Love potions made great comedy because they exaggerated what everyone already knew. Attraction is unpredictable. Audiences laughed at the idea of someone guzzling a brew and falling for the first person they saw, because deep down they knew that didn't look much different from real life. Drink this and you'll be in love forever was funny, precisely because in reality love often struck just as suddenly, irrationally, and inconveniently, minus the lizard dust. What's fascinating is how literature treated love potions as both metaphor and plot device. On one level they were literal, flowers squeezed on eyelids, draughts passed in goblets. On another, they stood for the uncontrollable nature of love itself. Desire didn't follow reason. It ambushed, enchanted, and disoriented. Writers didn't need to convince audiences that love was magical. They just gave it a physical form in the shape of a potion. And of course, these stories weren't just entertainment. They reflected social anxieties. Men feared being bewitched into passion. Women feared losing agency to manipulative suitors. The idea that love could be artificially induced made people laugh, but it also touched a nerve. It revealed how fragile and uncertain romance was in a world where marriages were contracts and true affection was rare. Looking back, it's easy to see the continuity between apothecaries and playwrights. One sold bottled hope in a vial, the other sold it in a story. Both offered audiences a way to dream, to laugh, and to imagine that maybe, just maybe, love could be nudged into existence by something outside themselves. Whether brewed in a pot or conjured on stage, the message was the same. Love is chaotic, unpredictable, and irresistible, even when it comes in the form of a donkey-headed crush. If there was one group not swooning over the idea of love potions, it was the church. Renaissance priests, monks, and theologians had little patience for bubbling brews meant to kindle lust. To them, love potions weren't just questionable medicine, they were spiritual landmines. While apothecaries were bottling hope, and poets were romanticizing enchanted draughts, clerics were warning congregations that such drinks reeked of witchcraft, sin, and demonic influence. Priests were less worried about eternal love and more about eternal damnation. From the church's perspective, love was supposed to come in neat, divinely sanctioned packages: marriage for procreation, chastity outside of it, and devotion directed more toward God than your neighbor's daughter. Potions, on the other hand, promised to stir up lust, override free will, and inflame passions outside the tidy boundaries of doctrine. To clerical minds, that wasn't just a social problem, it was a theological one. If a potion could bend someone's heart, it suggested that humans had found a way to play God, which was a dangerous implication in a society that still burned people for less. Preachers frequently thundered against such practices in sermons. They lumped love potions together with fortune-telling, necromancy, and the summoning of spirits. Manuals for confessors instructed priests to question penitents about philtries, a common term for potions, and to treat them as evidence of sinful dabbling in forbidden arts. A woman slipping herbs into her husband's drink to spark affection might think she was practicing a harmless folk custom. The parish priest, however, saw it as cozying up to the devil's kitchen. The fear went beyond morality into the realm of witchcraft. The late medieval and Renaissance periods saw an increasing paranoia about witches, and anything that smelled of secret knowledge or hidden power was suspect. Women were especially vulnerable to accusations. If a man suddenly grew enamored of someone against all reason, tongues wagged. Had she used a potion? The church was ready to provide the explanation. Yes, and she had probably signed a pact with the devil too. What in one context was just parsley in wine, in another became evidence of heresy. There was also the issue of consent. Even in an era when arranged marriages and rigid hierarchies limited choice, the church valued the appearance of free will in unions. Potions that supposedly forced love undermined that premise. If someone loved you because they drank a bewitched cup, was it real love or a counterfeit, engineered with demonic help? For theologians, that was not just a moral hazard but a sacrilege. They argued that true love had to be voluntary, blessed, and pure. Anything else was suspect, no matter how sweet it tasted. And yet, despite warnings, people kept turning to potions. This left the church in the awkward position of railing against practices that continued in villages and even in noble courts. The harder clerics condemned them, the more tantalizing potions seemed to the curious and the desperate. In some cases, denunciations may even have had the opposite effect. If priests were this worried, surely there must be something powerful in those concoctions. A whispered rumor of diabolical influence only added to the aura of mystery. Confessional records and ecclesiastical court cases show how messy the reality was. Some parishioners confessed to using herbs or charms, then asked for forgiveness. Others denied accusations, insisting what they'd brewed was just harmless tea. Priests themselves sometimes disagreed on where the line lay. Was a rosemary infusion a folk remedy, or was it demonic meddling? The ambiguity allowed both leniency and paranoia to flourish side by side. The irony is that while priests condemned potions, they were not immune to the broader culture's fascination with them. Some clerics collected herbals and medical texts that included recipes suspiciously close to love brews. Others dabbled in astrology or alchemy, carefully framing their interests as natural philosophy rather than superstition. The pulpit thundered against sinful philtres, but the monastery library quietly preserved knowledge about them. The church's suspicion also shaped the way love potions were portrayed in popular imagination. Literature, plays, and folklore often echoed clerical warnings by showing potions leading to ruin. A man ensnared by a filtered drink might waste away, bewitched and helpless. A woman who brewed one might end up at the stake. These stories reinforced the idea that potions were both alluring and dangerous, the ultimate forbidden fruit. From a humorous angle, the image of a priest preaching furiously against lustful brews while his parishioners sat in the pews, nodding solemnly but secretly wondering if that parsley tea their aunt swore by counted as demonic, is irresistible. One can imagine the whispered conversations afterward. Father said it's a sin. Does that mean it works? Religion and romance have always made awkward bedfellows, and in the Renaissance they collided in every goblet spiced with suspicion. In the end, the Church's reaction tells us as much about power as it does about love. Condemning potions wasn't just about saving souls, it was about maintaining control. Love was supposed to be regulated by God's will, interpreted by the clergy, and sanctioned through the sacraments. A humble potion threatened that authority by suggesting that ordinary people could bypass divine order and stir up destiny in their kitchens. To the Church, that wasn't just risky, it was rebellion. Yet people kept brewing, priests kept warning, and the dance between desire and doctrine continued. Eternal love might be celebrated in sermons, but eternal damnation loomed larger in the margins of potion recipes, and for every cleric condemning philtres from the pulpit, there was probably someone in the back row thinking, well, just in case it couldn't hurt to try. In the Renaissance, brewing a love potion could be the fastest way to get yourself labelled a witch. It didn't matter if your magic was nothing more than rosemary steeped in wine or a sprig of parsley slipped into a stew. If someone decided it worked too well, suspicion followed close behind. If you grew herbs and your neighbor's husband liked them, congratulations, you're a witch now. Women bore the brunt of this paranoia. Potion making, especially love philters, was often associated with female knowledge. Midwives, widows, and healers. Women who tended gardens and understood plants were natural suspects. They occupied a strange social space, needed for their skills, yet distrusted for their independence. A woman who could help with childbirth, ease a fever, or provide a charm to inspire affection was useful, until she wasn't. When the winds of gossip shifted, her remedies became sorcery. The Church's teachings and the court's paranoia amplified this danger. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous witch-hunting handbook of the late 15th century, explicitly linked women's alleged weakness to witchcraft. Love magic featured prominently in these accusations, framed as a sign of women's supposed tendency to manipulate men. If a man's affections changed suddenly, it was rarely chalked up to his own wandering eye. More often, people whispered that a woman must have bewitched him. A jealous wife, a rejected mistress, or a rival neighbor could point fingers, and suddenly the simplest herbal brew became evidence of a pact with the devil. The irony was that much of this so-called witchcraft drew from ordinary folk practices. Brewing teas, using charms, or blessing herbs with prayers were traditions that stretched back centuries. They were part of daily life, blending superstition, healing, and a little hopeful magic. But in the charged atmosphere of Renaissance Europe, these customs could turn deadly. A woman who had once been sought after for advice might now find herself dragged before a magistrate. The fear of love philters was heightened by their reputation for interfering with free will. The idea that someone could be forced into affection smacked of unnatural power, and that power, in the eyes of authorities, came from dark sources. Stories circulated of witches giving men drinks that made them docile, enslaved to lust, or foolishly devoted. Whether or not the tales had any truth, they confirmed existing fears. Women wielding potions weren't just playing with herbs, they were allegedly tampering with souls. Accusations often had little to do with reality and everything to do with power. A woman with too much influence over a man, whether he was a husband, a neighbor, or a local lord, was a threat. Labeling her a witch stripped her of authority and gave communities a way to explain uncomfortable relationships. A man's infidelity. Clearly the other woman bewitched him, a wealthy widow refusing remarriage. She must be sustaining herself with diabolical arts. The love potion was a convenient scapegoat for all manner of social discomforts. Court records reveal chilling examples. In some cases, women confessed under torture to providing philters, often describing simple recipes of herbs and wine. Others maintained their innocence but were condemned anyway. The language of these trials often blurred potion-making with outright diabolism, as if a handful of basil automatically implied midnight covens and satanic rituals. It was a leap in logic, but one that fit the anxieties of the time. There's also an element of tragic humor here. Picture a woman handing her neighbor a cup of spiced ale, meant as nothing more than a comforting gesture. He happens to fancy her afterward, and suddenly whispers spread, she's ensnared him. Or imagine a young man falling in love, and embarrassed to admit it, blaming it on a potion. It's easier to say, she bewitched me, than I have poor self-control. In this way, potions became the perfect excuse for human folly, and women paid the price. Interestingly, accusations of potion brewing weren't confined to the poor. Even noble women and royal mistresses faced rumors of love magic. At court, where power and desire intertwined, it was common to whisper that a king's mistress had ensnared him with a philter. It explained why powerful men made reckless decisions. Political failures weren't their fault, but the result of witchcraft. Blaming women's potions preserved the dignity of rulers while demonizing their partners. This fear of female influence reveals the gendered anxieties of Renaissance society. Male authority was supposed to be rational, godly, and unshakable. If women could sway it with something as simple as a cup of wine, it undermined the entire social order. Thus, love philters were cast not as romantic curiosities, but as tools of subversion, gateways to sin and sorcery. And yet, despite the dangers, women continued to practice their herbal arts. Some did so quietly within trusted circles. Others defied suspicion, confident in their role as healers and helpers. For many, it wasn't about power or sorcery. It was about offering comfort, hope, and a sense of control in a world where options were few. Looking back, the witchcraft connection highlights the darker side of Renaissance love potion culture. What began as superstition and yearning became tangled in fear, gender politics, and persecution. Behind every accusation of a love philter lay a deeper story of mistrust and social tension. So the next time you imagine Renaissance love potions, picture not just the apothecaries' jars and Shakespearean jokes, but also the village woman staring down a courtroom, accused of devilish arts because her neighbor's husband smiled at her. Love, it turns out, wasn't the only thing these potions stirred up. They also ignited centuries of paranoia. When ordinary peasants toyed with love potions, the risks were personal. Maybe heartbreak, maybe indigestion, maybe the neighbor calling you a witch. But when queens, mistresses, and courtiers dabbled in such brews, the stakes weren't just hearts, they were thrones. In the Renaissance, power and passion were often indistinguishable, and nothing set the rumor mills churning faster than the suggestion that a ruler's decisions were guided not by reason, but by a suspiciously spiced glass of wine. Some rulers lost kingdoms not to wars, but to a suspiciously spiced glass of wine. The idea that monarchs and nobles could be manipulated by potions was irresistible to contemporaries. It explained the inexplicable, why a king would lavish lands and titles on a mistress, why a duke would abandon a strategic marriage, why a ruler might suddenly turn hostile or affectionate. After all, if great men were meant to embody rational authority, their lapses had to come from somewhere, And what better scapegoat than a bewitching drink slipped into their goblet? Take France, for example. The courts of the Valois kings in the 16th century were rife with tales of mistresses accused of witchcraft and potion brewing. Catherine de' Medici, the formidable queen consort and later queen mother, was dogged by rumors that she used poisons and philters to control political rivals. Whether or not she ever touched a love potion, the gossip reflected a real fear that women in proximity to power might tip the scales of politics through alchemy and sorcery. Catherine's Italian background and her association with astrologers only fueled the fire. If the king favored her counsel over his nobles, surely it was because she had brewed something into his nightly wine. Mistresses were especially vulnerable to these accusations. They already wielded influence by virtue of intimacy, so attributing their success to potions made their power seem unnatural, dangerous rather than deserved. Diane de Poitiers, mistress of Henry II of France, was sometimes whispered about as maintaining her sway through secret remedies. The insinuation was clear. No man could remain so devoted to a woman well into her later years unless magic was involved, a bottle of youth, a draught of passion. Such stories were easier to swallow than the simpler explanation that Henry just genuinely adored her. The rumors weren't confined to France. In England, the Tudor court also swirled with tales of sorcery and manipulation. Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII, was accused by enemies of ensnaring the king with witchcraft, her famous dark eyes described as bewitching. Some insisted she had used potions to bend his will, convincing him to break with Rome and plunge England into religious upheaval. Whether Anne actually slipped herbs into Henry's wine is doubtful, but the suspicion reveals how threatening it seemed for a woman to sway politics through love. If Henry abandoned queen and pope alike, it must have been more than charm. Surely it was sorcery. Italian courts were no less colourful. In Florence, Venice, and Rome, noble families traded accusations of rivals employing potions to secure marriages or sabotage alliances. Chronicles mention brides drinking fortified wines to ensure devotion, and rivals whispering that their opponent's sudden success at court was due to bewitched rulers. In a society where family honor and political survival depended on advantageous matches, the idea that someone had stacked the deck with magic was both terrifying and believable. What's fascinating is how these stories blurred the line between passion and politics. A king favoring a mistress over his ministers could destabilize governments. A noble securing marriage through alleged potions could tip the balance of alliances. The love potion, in these tales, wasn't just a private indulgence, it was a political weapon, a liquid coup d'etat. From a modern perspective, the comedy is almost irresistible. Imagine a council of advisors trying to explain their king's disastrous decision to give away land or ignore a treaty. They murmur gravely, "Sire, we believe your judgment has been compromised." Translation: we think someone slipped saffron wine into your goblet, and now you're writing sonnets instead of ruling. It's bureaucracy undone by a brew, diplomacy drowned in rosewater. The paranoia surrounding political love potions also reveals a deeper anxiety. Male rulers were supposed to embody strength, reason, and divine authority. Admitting they could be swayed by emotion was unthinkable, so when they acted irrationally, blaming philters preserved their image. Better to say the king was bewitched than the king made a bad decision. In this sense, the myth of political potions was a safety valve, allowing subjects to critique their rulers without directly accusing them of incompetence. And yet, the fascination with these stories also speaks to the Renaissance imagination. People believed that the same forces stirring the heavens and shaping the humors could just as easily ripple through royal courts. A potion was both plausible and poetic, an explanation that tied love, power, and fate together in one intoxicating narrative. Were political love potions real? Probably not in the literal sense, though rulers certainly consumed plenty of exotic concoctions, but the belief in them was real enough to change reputations, fuel accusations, and even justify executions. A queen or mistress might never have brewed a potion in her life, yet her enemies could still paint her as a sorceress, her influence reframed as unnatural. The myth was as potent as any drink, so in the Renaissance, Love potions weren't just about longing hearts. They could shake dynasties, spark scandals, and destabilize nations. To the ordinary villager, they were gossip over ale. To courtiers, they were whispers that could topple reputations. And to kings, they were both temptation and excuse. Passion and politics, stirred together in a cup, heady, dangerous, and just as likely to ruin a kingdom as to win a kiss. When Renaissance apothecaries and physicians reached for their jars of herbs and powders, they weren't just fumbling in the dark, they believed they had science on their side. Granted, it wasn't our science, with microscopes and peer-reviewed journals. It was the science of humors, bodily fluids, and the eternal balancing act of hot and cold, wet and dry. To them, a love potion wasn't hocus pocus. It was a logical intervention in the delicate plumbing of the human body. Too much phlegm? Clearly the reason nobody flirts with you. The intellectual foundation for this science stretched back to the ancient world. Hippocrates and Galen had laid down the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was linked to both a temperament and a bodily condition. Blood made you lively and passionate. Phlegm made you sluggish and calm. Yellow bile made you fiery and irritable. Black bile made you melancholic and brooding. A person's health, personality, and attractiveness were all thought to depend on keeping these fluids in balance. The Renaissance, obsessed with rediscovering classical knowledge, clung to this framework with pride. So how did this connect to love potions? Quite directly. If passion was associated with heat and moisture, then a potion designed to spark romance needed to warm the blood and moisten the body's inner workings. Ingredients like cinnamon, ginger, or saffron weren't just tasty, they were classified as hot substances that stimulated desire. Honey, wine, and certain oils were considered moistening, helping the body's fluids flow more freely. A well-designed love potion, according to humoral science, was like a furnace carefully stoked to the right temperature. Conversely, if someone was deemed too cold and dry, classic signs of an unromantic personality, then remedies might involve warming spices and rich wines. If they were too hot and wet, imagine someone overly excitable or lusty. The theory suggested cooling herbs like mint or violet to bring them back down. Love was less about chemistry as we know it, and more about thermostat management. If your heart was icy, they poured in cinnamon. If you were boiling over, they dosed you with lettuce. Romance in this model could be fixed with a little home heating repair. Physicians even drew diagrams linking body parts, humors, and planetary influences to explain why certain mixtures should work. The liver, thought to produce blood, was tied to vitality and passion. The brain, full of phlegm, was the seat of sluggishness. The heart was the furnace of the body, pumping warmth and life. Thus, a potion that cleared phlegm from the brain or stoked the heart's fire was not considered witchcraft, it was medical science. A doctor in Florence or Paris could write you a prescription for romance, with the same seriousness we reserve for antibiotics. It didn't stop with ingredients. Even preparation methods were framed scientifically. Brewing a potion during the waxing moon, for example, wasn't seen as superstition but as aligning with natural cycles of growth and increase. Grinding herbs to a fine powder released their virtues, which could then be transferred more efficiently into the body. Adding wine was not just for flavor, it carried the active properties deep into the blood like an early version of targeted drug delivery. From their perspective, these practices weren't magical, they were rational, observable, and consistent with the best knowledge available. Of course, there was a comic side to all this. Imagine a physician gravely diagnosing a young man: your blood is too thin, your bile too stagnant, and your phlegm dangerously abundant. No wonder she ignores you at dances. Or advising a woman, add more saffron to your wine. It will heat your temperament and dry your excessive coldness. By next Sunday, you'll be irresistible. It sounds absurd now, but in a world without germ theory or endocrinology, humors were the closest thing to logic. It's worth remembering that this system wasn't entirely useless. Many ingredients chosen for their hot or moist qualities did have real physiological effects. Spices can raise body temperature and quicken the pulse. Alcohol lowers inhibitions. Honey soothes and energizes. Even if the reasoning was off, the results sometimes reinforced the theory. A man drinks spiced wine, feels flushed and confident, and assumes the humors have been balanced. Success, at least until the hangover sets in. This humoral approach also explains why some potions veered into dangerous territory. If a little heat was good, then a lot must be better, right? Hence the use of harsher stimulants like cantharides, Spanish fly, or toxic plants like belladonna, both classified as powerfully heating substances. The science told them that these ingredients could fan the flames of passion. In practice, they often just fanned the flames of gastric distress. What makes this chapter of potion history fascinating is how earnestly people believed in it, the same logic that governed diets, medical treatments, and even city planning was applied to matters of the heart. Love was not an accident, it was a condition, diagnosable and treatable like a fever. Too cold? Spice it up. Too hot? Cool it down. Too melancholic? Sweeten it with honey. The language of romance was written in the vocabulary of fluids. Looking back, it's easy to laugh at the earnestness of it all. But there's also something oddly endearing. The Renaissance physician, squinting over his patient's pulse and prescribing cinnamon wine for passion, wasn't trying to deceive, he was trying to apply the best science he knew to the universal problem of desire. And while we may chuckle at phlegm equals unsexy, the impulse to reduce love to biology hasn't gone away. We just trade humors for hormones, herbs for pharmaceuticals, and star charts for dating algorithms. The search for a formula to explain attraction continues, even if we've stopped grinding deer antlers into the mix. In the swirling world of Renaissance love potions, gender shaped everything. Who brewed them, who consumed them, and who paid the price when things went wrong. Recipes weren't just recipes. They carried the weight of social expectations, stereotypes, and double standards. In short, potions weren't gender-neutral beverages of affection. They were tools in a system that often rewarded men for desire while punishing women for the same. If it succeeded, credit the man. If it failed, burn the woman. Let's start with who actually made the potions. In most cases it was women. Not queens with gilded cups, but the everyday women who kept gardens, tended kitchens, and knew how to coax flavor and power from herbs. Wives, widows, and midwives had practical knowledge of plants that could heal, soothe, or excite. This placed them in a curious position, both respected and feared. A woman who could ease a baby's colic might also know which herbs sparked desire. She wasn't a scientist in the university sense, but she was a keeper of intimate, embodied knowledge. That made her valuable and vulnerable. Men, on the other hand, tended to dominate the more formalized side of potion making. Apothecaries, physicians, and alchemists were usually male, backed by guilds and institutions. They might sell the same herbs or even stranger concoctions, but their authority shielded them. A physician grinding cinnamon into wine was practicing medicine. A village woman doing the same could be accused of witchcraft. The difference wasn't the ingredients, it was who held the pestle. When it came to drinking the potions, gender dynamics played out in equally telling ways. Women were often the supposed targets, the ones whose love or fidelity was sought. Men were encouraged to drink brews meant to inflame their vigor, while women were portrayed as being dosed to ensure devotion or fertility. In other words, potions reinforced existing roles, men as pursuers, women as prizes. The drinks weren't just about passion, they were about control, desire shaped to fit patriarchal molds. And yet, women also drank potions, especially those tied to marriage or fertility. A young bride might be urged to sip a honeyed brew to ensure harmony in her new home. A barren wife might be given mixtures of herbs and animal parts to awaken her womb. In these cases, potions weren't indulgences, they were burdens, ways of placing responsibility for fertility and affection squarely on women's shoulders. If a marriage soured or a cradle stayed empty, people rarely blamed the man's disinterest or biology. They asked what potion the woman had or hadn't taken. Then came the question of blame. If a potion seemed to work, if a nobleman's affection grew, or a husband's passion revived, it was usually credited to the man's natural vitality, or fate's blessing. He was praised for his charm, his strength, his destiny. The potion itself faded into the background, a silent helper. But if the potion failed, if the romance collapsed or the body suffered, the finger pointed firmly at the woman who brewed it. She must have botched the mixture, used the wrong herbs, or worse, tampered with sorcery. The very same knowledge that had given her quiet power now became her liability. These double standards weren't confined to peasants and villages. At royal courts, powerful women were also ensnared by them. A mistress accused of bewitching a king with philters was framed as unnatural, manipulative and dangerous. A man who showered her with gifts was described as bewitched. Her own charm or intelligence was dismissed. The potion explained his folly while damning her. If he prospered, it was his glory. If he faltered, it was her fault. What's striking is how these gendered attitudes turned love potions into a mirror of Renaissance anxieties about women's influence. Men's authority was supposed to be rational, godly, and unshakable. Women, by contrast, were cast as emotional, cunning, and potentially subversive. A potion in a woman's hands became a symbol of that fear, the idea that she might overturn the natural order, seizing influence through secret means. Better to accuse her of witchcraft than to admit that male authority could be swayed by love. And yet, humor creeps in at the edges. Imagine the absurdity of a man boasting at a banquet. "She drinks my every word," while his mistress sits quietly, knowing he actually drinks her every potion. Or the grim irony of a woman in a village muttering, "He begged me for help, I gave him herbs, and now everyone says I cursed him." It's a dark comedy of double standards, where affection becomes evidence and hope becomes a crime. Still, women weren't merely victims. Many wielded their potion knowledge strategically, carving out space for agency in a society that denied them formal power. A clever midwife might build trust by offering safe, effective remedies alongside whispered love charms. A wife might use her herbs not just to please her husband, but to secure her own place in the household. Potions gave women a language of influence, even if it was a dangerous one. Meanwhile, men continued to appropriate the same practices under safer labels. An alchemist's elixir of passion could contain the same herbs as a widow's brew, but the alchemist was applauded for his experiments while the widow risked the stake. The difference was gender, not science. In the end, the story of gender and potions is one of imbalance between men and women, between recognition and blame, between protection and peril. Potions offered women both empowerment and exposure, lifting them up in one breath and condemning them in the next. Men could take credit for love when it bloomed and shrug off failure as witchcraft when it didn't. Women, caught in the middle, bore the cost of both. So when we think of Renaissance love potions, it isn't just the ingredients that matter. It's the hands that mixed them, the lips that drank them, and the judgments that followed. Potions might have been designed to spark desire, but what they really revealed was the deep, enduring divide in how men and women were allowed to play the game of love. If you want to know what Renaissance love looked like behind closed doors, forget the frescoes of Venus or the lute songs sung under balconies. The true romance lived in kitchens and household manuals, where the line between dinner and magic blurred into something both practical and enchanting. Surviving recipe books from the period are fascinating, not only for what they tell us about what people ate, but also for what they hoped those meals could do. Half cookbook, half spell book. Imagine Gordon Ramsay shouting, "You call this an aphrodisiac," as someone stirs frog dust into a stew. Unlike apothecaries or alchemists who cloaked their brews in mystery, household manuals often approached potions with a domestic straightforwardness. These were instructions meant for wives, widows, or housekeepers who wanted to keep their families healthy, their larders stocked, and occasionally their partners passionate. You might open a manual expecting instructions on how to pickle cabbage, and 2 pages later stumble on a recipe to excite the affections of a husband grown cold. In Renaissance kitchens, seasoning and seduction shared the same shelf. The recipes themselves were a blend of the ordinary and the bizarre. Many relied on ingredients straight from the pantry: honey, cinnamon, cloves, almonds, or wine. These had symbolic associations. sweetness for harmony, heat for passion, richness for fertility. A common recipe might instruct a woman to stew pears with cloves and drizzle them with honey before serving to her beloved, promising that his heart would be softened as the fruit. Romantic and practical, assuming you didn't burn the pears. But household manuals didn't stop at the pantry. Some ventured boldly into the strange. A Venetian collection might suggest steeping dried sparrow hearts in wine. A German text might recommend grinding the liver of a hare caught in the season of rutting to stir up vigor. And an English household record even hints at a recipe involving powdered ivory mixed with ale, because nothing says eternal devotion like turning your drink into dental paste. These manuals didn't raise eyebrows. They were accepted as part of a world where food, medicine, and magic constantly overlapped. What makes these recipes so captivating is the mix of ritual and practicality. A dish might require stirring clockwise 3 times while reciting a verse, or plucking herbs only on a Friday, the day of Venus. Cooking wasn't just about heat and seasoning, it was about timing, symbolism, and intention. The kitchen became a theater of love, where chopping onions could be as mystical as consulting the stars, and while these recipes might seem quaint or comical, they reveal the creativity of Renaissance households. Without formal science, people leaned on symbolism, observation, and tradition. Garlic was warming, so it must stir passion. Almonds resembled seeds, so they must promote fertility. Honey sweetened life and love alike. The logic might not pass a modern lab test, but in the kitchen it made sense and, importantly, it tasted better than arsenic. Some manuals even blurred into outright charms. A recipe could instruct, boil rosemary and thyme in wine, and whilst it seethes, think of thy beloved and whisper his name. Was it the herbs or the whispering that did the work? For Renaissance cooks, the two were inseparable. The act of making the potion was as powerful as the potion itself. Food was never just food, it was a medium of intention. It's also worth noting that many of these recipes doubled as legitimate dishes. A honeyed almond cake could be both dessert and aphrodisiac. Spiced wine could warm you on a cold night, and allegedly in other ways as well. This overlap meant that love potions could be served in plain sight. A wife might present her husband with a fragrant stew, and he would never know whether it was dinner or destiny. That plausible deniability was part of the charm and the danger. Humor lurks in the imagined scenarios. Picture a harried Renaissance cook trying to prepare both supper and seduction, juggling a rabbit liver, cloves, and the threat of guests arriving early. Or a husband suspiciously squinting at his cup of wine, muttering, "This tastes different," while his wife cheerfully insists it's just a new recipe. New recipe was the safest euphemism for filter after all. The survival of these manuals also tells us something about cultural priorities. Love potions weren't exotic rarities reserved for alchemists. They were woven into the fabric of daily life. People didn't just want to eat well, they wanted to love well. The cookbook became a handbook for managing both, and unlike Apothecary's costly brews, household recipes were accessible to anyone with a garden, a pantry, and a little imagination. Looking back, these texts feel both strange and familiar. Strange because we no longer grind sparrow hearts into our stews. Familiar because the idea of cooking as an act of love is still alive today. We still associate food with affection, the comfort of a shared meal, the sweetness of dessert offered to someone you care about. The Renaissance just took it a step further, seasoning supper with spells. So the next time you open a recipe book and see a line about chocolate cake being romantic, remember you're standing in a very long tradition. Renaissance cooks might not have had molten lava cakes, but they had honeyed pears, saffron stews, and whispered charms stirred into their broth. Their kitchens weren't just about feeding bodies, they were about feeding hearts too. If there was one way to bottle love without the risk of frog powder or arsenic poisoning, it was through scent. The Renaissance saw the rise of perfumes and scented oils as tools of seduction, subtle enough to pass as hygiene, yet potent enough to make an impression. Perfume was basically Axe body spray, but with fewer showers. In an age when bathing was not exactly a daily ritual, Fragrance was more than just luxury, it was survival. And when it came to matters of the heart, perfume became a love potion you didn't have to drink. Scent had always carried mystical associations. Ancient texts linked aromas to the soul, believing that sweet smells elevated the spirit while foul odors corrupted it. The Renaissance inherited these ideas and ran with them. If bad smells could repel, good smells could attract. Thus rosewater, musk, ambergris, and countless other fragrant substances were marketed not just as pleasant, but as magnetic. Perfume didn't merely cover odors, it was thought to alter moods, stir passions, and even align you with celestial forces. To walk into a room wearing musk wasn't just to smell nice, it was to declare yourself a walking incantation of desire. Rosewater was a particular favorite. Distilled from petals, it carried connotations of purity and love, tied directly to Venus herself. A noblewoman might dab it on her neck before a feast, while a merchant might spritz it into his wine for good measure. Its floral sweetness suggested softness and romance, a scent gentle enough to disarm suspicion. Rosewater was safe, elegant, and versatile, a potion of love hiding in plain sight. Musk, on the other hand, was anything but subtle. Derived from the glands of the musk deer, a fact rarely mentioned in polite conversation, musk was strong, earthy, and undeniably animalistic. To Renaissance noses, it was the olfactory equivalent of a bold pickup line. Musk didn't whisper, it shouted. Wear musk, and you were broadcasting vitality and virility to the room. Of course, like any strong scent, a little went a long way. Too much, and you risked clearing the banquet hall faster than a spilled chamber pot. But when used sparingly, musk was considered the very essence of erotic attraction. Ambergris joined the roster of romantic scents, a waxy substance from the intestines of sperm whales that aged into a musky, sweet aroma. By the 16th century, it was a coveted ingredient in both perfumes and potions. To dab ambergris on your skin was to carry the scent of wealth, rarity, and exotic seas. That it originated as something floating out of a whale's gut was carefully glossed over. Desire, it turns out, has always been willing to ignore questionable origins if the smell was good enough. Perfume culture also overlapped with medicine. Physicians prescribed aromatic baths or scented sachets to improve mood and health, which conveniently overlapped with improving romance. A man depressed from melancholic humors might be advised to carry a pomander, a ball filled with cloves, musk, and herbs. Was it medical, or was it seductive? In practice, it was both. The lines blurred until perfume became both remedy and romance, proof that sometimes smelling good was the best kind of potion. Perfume had a unique advantage over edible filters, plausible deniability. You could sprinkle saffron in wine and risk someone raising an eyebrow, but no one could accuse you of sorcery for dabbing rosewater on your wrists. It was socially acceptable, and even fashionable. That made it a safer way to enchant. A courtier might arrive at a feast wearing a carefully blended fragrance, leaving admirers to sigh over his natural charm. Natural had nothing to do with it. The apothecaries' perfumed oils were doing the heavy lifting. There was also a theatrical element. Scent lingered in rooms, on fabrics, in memory. A noble woman's scarf perfumed with musk might haunt a suitor long after she left. A gentleman's cloak scented with rosewater might seem to trail affection behind him. Perfume turned love into atmosphere, a potion that worked invisibly, constantly, and without a single sip. Of course, there was humor in how people used it. One can imagine a Renaissance ball where half the guests are swooning, not from love, but from the overwhelming combination of musk, rosewater, and ambergris clashing in the air. Or a would-be suitor dousing himself so heavily in deer musk that he smelled less like a lover and more like he'd wrestled a stable full of animals. Subtlety was an art, and not everyone mastered it. Perfume also carried an element of status. While peasants might rely on garlic and parsley in their brews, nobles flaunted their wealth through imported scents. To smell of saffron or ambergris was to declare your connection to global trade, your access to luxury, and your readiness to woo with more than words. Love became international, packaged in ships, sold in markets and dabbed behind ears. What stands out today is how modern this all feels. We may not grind musk deer glands anymore, but the principle remains. Perfume and cologne are still marketed as bottled attraction, promising confidence, passion, or irresistible allure. The Renaissance may not have had slick advertisements, but the message was the same: spray this, and someone will fall for you. So, in kitchens and courts, perfumes became the safe, socially acceptable love potions of the Renaissance. No frogs, no poisons, no risk of witch trials, just a dab of rosewater or musk and you could carry the promise of passion wherever you went. Invisible, intoxicating, and always just on the edge of excess, perfume was the most elegant filter of them all. When you think of alchemists in the Renaissance, you probably picture hooded men hunched over bubbling flasks, trying to turn lead into gold. And yes, that image isn't far off. But the ambitions of alchemists went far beyond wealth. They promised cures for diseases, the secret to eternal youth, and naturally the secret to eternal love. If apothecaries sold parsley wine to nervous peasants, alchemists went for the high-end market, kings, nobles, and wealthy patrons who wanted magic in a bottle. The only thing they reliably transformed was your wallet into smoke. Alchemy was a curious mix of chemistry, mysticism, and theatre. Its practitioners worked in smoky laboratories filled with glass alembics, strange powders, and manuscripts covered in symbols. On the surface, they claimed to be pursuing noble knowledge about the transformation of matter, but those transformations had very human appeal. Why stop at lead into gold when you could also turn loneliness into devotion? If you could promise eternal riches, surely you could promise eternal romance too. Love elixirs in alchemical circles were often tied to the same lofty goals as their other experiments. The elixir of life, the potion that would grant immortality, was sometimes framed as also ensuring eternal vigor and passion. To drink it was not only to live forever, but to love forever. Naturally, no one ever actually achieved immortality. But it didn't stop alchemists from claiming partial successes. I haven't perfected eternal life yet, they might say, but try this draught, it will at least make her notice you. The language of alchemical love potions was heavy with symbolism. Gold, the perfect and incorruptible metal, represented divine love and perfection. Silver symbolized purity and fidelity. Copper, linked to the planet Venus, embodied desire. By mixing these metals, often shaved, dissolved, or heated with herbs, alchemists claimed they could align the forces of nature with the forces of passion. Drink this, and you weren't just consuming a brew, you were ingesting harmony, balance, and the universe's hidden sympathies. Or, less romantically, you were drinking metallic sludge with a side of indigestion. What made alchemists particularly dangerous or entertaining was their ability to cloak failure in mystery. If a potion didn't work, it wasn't because they'd failed, it was because the stars weren't properly aligned, or because the patron's soul wasn't sufficiently pure. Conveniently, this meant more payments for more refinements. Love, like gold, was always just one more experiment away. Some patrons bought into it wholeheartedly. Renaissance courts were fascinated by alchemy, not just as science but as spectacle. A duke or king might keep an alchemist on retainer, half out of hope for miracles, and half because the performance was mesmerizing. Imagine walking into a candlelit chamber filled with glass vessels bubbling in every color, the air heavy with exotic scents, while a solemn figure in robes explained how he was distilling the essence of Venus herself. Even if you doubted the outcome, the theater was worth the investment. Love elixirs weren't confined to romance alone. Some promised to rekindle marital affection, others to ensure fertility, and still others to protect against infidelity. The idea was that alchemy could bind not just metals but people. If mercury could unite with sulfur in mystical union, why not man with woman? Alchemists loved drawing parallels between chemical marriages and human ones, claiming that their brews mirrored the eternal bonds of the cosmos. It all sounded poetic, at least until your bond turned out to be nausea, and yet humor sneaks in. Picture a wealthy nobleman gulping down a draught of liquid gold and saffron, wincing at the taste, then nodding solemnly as the alchemist assured him, You will feel the results soon. The only thing he felt was his stomach rebelling. Or imagine a lady of the court sipping a metallic elixir and convincing herself that her sudden dizziness was the spark of love rather than the onset of mild poisoning. Hope, as always, did most of the heavy lifting. Interestingly, not all alchemists were outright frauds. Some were genuine experimenters who stumbled toward real discoveries. Distillation techniques, laboratory equipment, and even certain chemical extractions developed by alchemists laid foundations for modern science. But when it came to love elixirs, their claims far outpaced their results. They borrowed authority from symbols and science-y language, mixing metaphors as freely as they mixed herbs and metals, and their patrons, desperate for wealth, health, or romance, were happy to suspend disbelief. The love elixir craze also reveals how interconnected Renaissance ambitions were. Wealth, longevity, and love were all seen as part of the same pursuit of perfection. To have gold without love was meaningless. To have love without health was fleeting. Alchemists sold the fantasy that you could have it all in a single vial. That fantasy was powerful enough to fund endless experiments, even if the only transformation happening was gold coins disappearing into the alchemist's purse. In the end, alchemists didn't discover eternal life or eternal love. What they did create was a stage where science, mysticism, and longing collided. Their elixirs were part chemistry, part poetry, part scam, and part wish fulfillment, and while no alchemical potion ever truly delivered love, the belief in them shows how far people would go when desire met desperation. So the next time you see a modern ad promising that a pill, a perfume, or a drink will make you irresistible, remember, the Renaissance alchemists were already there, selling bottled Venus centuries ago. The packaging was different, the language was mystical, but the promise was the same. Eternal love, guaranteed, just don't ask for a refund. If the Renaissance had tabloids, their front pages would have been filled with two things: wars and whispers of who was slipping potions into whose goblet. Royal courts were engines of gossip, and nothing fueled rumor faster than a monarch's sudden change of heart. If a king suddenly fell madly in love, people whispered potion, or just midlife crisis. Whether real or imagined, love filters became the convenient explanation for all sorts of questionable royal behavior, from scandalous affairs to catastrophic political blunders. France, perhaps more than anywhere, was a cauldron of such stories. The Valois dynasty in the 16th century was infamous for its mix of courtly intrigue and whispered sorcery. Catherine de' Medici, queen consort and later queen mother, was dogged by allegations of dabbling in poisons and philters, though most historians agree these charges were exaggerated by her enemies. The idea that she or her Italian retinue had secret recipes for controlling hearts and minds stuck like perfume on velvet. When King Henry II was said to be utterly besotted with his mistress Diane de Poitiers, detractors claimed it wasn't devotion but Diana's potion craft that kept him faithful. In truth, Henry may just have liked her company and her intelligence, but scandalous stories of enchanted wines spread faster than any sober explanation. Italy, the homeland of Machiavelli and endless court intrigues, also had its fair share of potion rumors. The Medici family in Florence and the Borgia clan in Rome were magnets for accusations of mixing politics with poison. Lucrezia Borgia, in particular, was accused of slipping enemies or lovers mysterious concoctions. While much of this was propaganda designed to tarnish her reputation, the persistence of such stories shows how readily contemporaries believed that power and passion were stirred together. If a duke made a rash political alliance, surely a woman had dosed him. If a pope seemed unusually fond of someone, whispers of bewitched devotion followed. England was hardly immune to the trend. Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII, faced whispers that she had seduced the king, not with charm but with sorcery. Her sharp wit, striking eyes, and sudden rise to power seemed too much for detractors to credit to her alone. Love potions became the perfect excuse. She had tricked Henry into breaking with Rome, defying his queen, and overturning the realm's religious order. The truth, that Henry was impulsive, headstrong, and desperately obsessed with producing an heir was far less flattering. Blaming a potion preserved the king's dignity while demonizing Anne, and when Anne eventually fell, the narrative of bewitchment helped justify her downfall. Scandals weren't confined to kings and queens. Lesser nobles and courtiers were also accused of slipping filters to gain favor. A young courtier who rose too quickly in a queen's esteem? Clearly a potion. A nobleman who fell out of love with his politically advantageous wife? Obviously bewitched by another woman's brew. These stories spread not because they were true, but because they made sense to people steeped in a world of potions, humors, and astrology. Love was rarely considered natural at court. It was always suspected of being engineered. The accusations could turn deadly. In France, the so-called affair of the poisons, a sprawling scandal of the late 17th century, with roots in Renaissance fears, saw noble women accused of employing witches and potion sellers to secure love and influence. Testimonies claimed that affection powders were sprinkled into food, that noble mistresses maintained secret laboratories, and that priests were bribed to bless philters. Though many confessions were wrung out under torture, the idea that potions shaped courtly passions gripped the public imagination. In the eyes of contemporaries, if politics looked irrational, there had to be a supernatural reason. It's easy to see why these rumors thrived. Monarchs were expected to act rationally, balancing dynasties and empires like chess pieces, but real life often got messy. Kings fell hopelessly in love with unsuitable partners, nobles pursued affairs that endangered alliances, and mistresses wielded influence far beyond their official status. To explain these human quirks, contemporaries reached for potions. It was easier to believe a king was drugged than to admit he was simply foolish. And of course, these stories made excellent court entertainment. Picture a banquet where courtiers whispered behind jeweled goblets. Did you see how the duke stared at her? Definitely a potion. Or a bishop muttering disapprovingly. He's not enchanted by her wit, I assure you. It's Spanish fly. Gossip thrived on attributing irrational behavior to philters. A king's passion wasn't embarrassing if it was caused. A mistress's influence wasn't threatening if it was unnatural. Potions were a gossip industry all their own. There's a certain humor in the way love potions became scapegoats for every romantic misstep. Imagine a modern parallel. Every time a politician has a scandal, instead of spin doctors, the explanation is, clearly he drank rosemary wine under the wrong moon. It's ridiculous, but it was a useful fiction in courts where reputation mattered as much as reality. In the end, whether or not any of these royal figures ever sipped enchanted brews, the belief that they might have was powerful. It shaped reputations, justified decisions, and sometimes even provided cover for conspiracies. Love potions at court weren't really about herbs or honey. They were about control, narrative, and the eternal temptation to blame magic for messy human hearts. The Renaissance was many things, an age of art, science, exploration, but it was not exactly a golden age of legal nuance. When it came to love potions, governments and courts were far less charmed than the people brewing them. To sip a suspicious liquid was one thing, to mix it was another. The Renaissance justice system: drink suspicious liquids? Fine. Mix suspicious liquids? Death. Potion making existed in a legal grey area for centuries. On one hand, much of it looked like harmless domestic medicine, brewing herbs, stirring wine with spices, or sprinkling honey into ale hardly seemed criminal. On the other hand, potions carried dangerous associations: witchcraft, poisoning, and manipulation of free will. By the 15th and 16th centuries, as witch hunts gained momentum, the noose around potion makers tightened. A cup of rosemary wine could be dismissed as folk tradition one week and prosecuted as sorcery the next. The first problem was classification. Was a love potion medicine, food, or magic? Authorities weren't always sure. In ecclesiastical courts, they often leaned towards sinful magic, lumping potions with charms and incantations. In secular courts, potions looked a lot like poisoning, especially when they went wrong. If someone died after drinking a brew, intent didn't matter. The maker could face charges of attempted murder or sorcery. The same parsley tea that might have been laughed off in one village could, under the wrong circumstances, end in trial. One infamous arena for legal crackdowns was France. By the late 16th century, the French courts were flooded with cases involving so-called sorcières accused of making powders and filters. Even noble families were implicated. Potion sellers, sometimes apothecaries, sometimes folk healers, were tried for allegedly enchanting nobles or endangering kings. The paranoia culminated in the affair of the poisons decades later, but its roots lay in Renaissance fears that love magic was just poison dressed up as romance. Italy saw similar anxieties. In city-states like Florence and Venice, civic records show women dragged before magistrates accused of administering drinks that inflamed desire. Often these were little more than herbal teas, but the courts interpreted them as unnatural coercion. The crime wasn't always the ingredients, it was the implication that free will had been tampered with. To Renaissance authorities, meddling with love was a dangerous form of social subversion. A marriage alliance ruined by bewitchment could have political consequences, so courts cracked down to preserve order. England, too, pursued love potion makers under the growing shadow of witchcraft statutes. By the reign of Elizabeth I, laws against witchcraft made it a felony to use charms or potions for love, fertility, or harm. Ordinary people, especially women, were at greatest risk. The line between midwife and sorceress was perilously thin. A woman accused of slipping a charm into ale could be hauled before a justice of the peace. While executions for love magic were less common than for outright witchcraft, the threat loomed. The punishments varied. Some potion makers were fined, whipped, or publicly shamed. Others faced imprisonment or banishment from their communities. In harsher cases, especially when deaths were involved, executions took place by hanging, burning, or drowning. The severity of the sentence often had less to do with the actual potion than with local politics, gossip, and the willingness of neighbors to testify. Courts, like potions, worked best when stirred with rumor. What makes this crackdown so revealing is how it exposed social fears. Potion making wasn't punished simply because it was dangerous. It was punished because it blurred categories authorities wanted kept tidy. Medicine versus magic, desire versus duty, natural versus supernatural. If love could be stirred in a cup, then priests, princes, and patriarchs weren't in charge. It was the potion maker who held the power. For Renaissance societies obsessed with hierarchy, that was intolerable. Humor creeps into the contradictions. Imagine a courtroom where a magistrate sternly lectures a woman. Love is sacred, ordained by God, and cannot be meddled with, only to adjourn the session and drink his physician-prescribed cordial water made of herbs and sugar for his gout. Or picture an unlucky potion seller hauled before a judge, insisting, "But it was just parsley," while the jury nods grimly, certain that parsley was clearly the devil's herb. The absurdity lay in the fact that everyone used herbs, but only some people were punished for them. Legal crackdowns also reflected gendered suspicion. Men who experimented with elixirs in alchemical laboratories were often tolerated, even admired for their scientific curiosity. Women with the same jars of powders risked being branded witches. The law mirrored society's double standards, punishing the powerless more harshly than the powerful. If a duchess slipped rosewater into her husband's goblet, it was romance. If a peasant woman did the same, it was a crime. And yet, despite the threats, people kept brewing. Court records wouldn't exist without constant demand. The fact that trials occurred again and again shows that potions continued to circulate, hidden in kitchens, whispered about in villages, and occasionally smuggled into courts. The crackdown may have silenced some voices, but it couldn't erase the desire for bottled love. So the Renaissance justice system tried to legislate desire, punishing those who dared to mix passion with herbs. But the irony is unavoidable. While governments condemned potions, they couldn't stop people from believing in them. Potions were dangerous not because they worked, but because people thought they might. And that belief was enough to shake marriages, disrupt alliances, and send unlucky potion makers to the gallows. In the end, The legal crackdown was less about parsley and more about power. Who controlled love? Who controlled marriage? Who controlled women's knowledge? All these questions bubbled under the surface of every trial. The courts could burn witches, but they couldn't burn the longing that kept people slipping herbs into goblets. The potions lived on, simmering quietly, even as the law thundered above them. Not all Renaissance potions were brewed with the same intent. Some were designed to spark affection, to make a reluctant suitor finally swoon, or to rekindle passion in a weary marriage bed. These were the so-called potions of desire, romantic in spirit, if sometimes queasy in execution. But another, darker category also existed, potions of control. These weren't about love at all. They were about domination, compliance, and power. One is creepy, the other is really creepy. The difference might sound subtle, but to Renaissance minds, it was huge. A potion of desire was about attraction, turning indifference into infatuation, planting seeds of passion where none had grown. It was romanticized, even if the methods were questionable. A young man might slip saffron wine into a cup, hoping the object of his affection would see him with fresh eyes. A wife might stir honey and basil into her husband's ale, praying to reignite his devotion. The intent, however flawed, was rooted in the language of love. Potions of control were another beast entirely. These aimed not to inspire love, but to bend will. They promised obedience, docility, or even outright enslavement of mind and body. Rather than sparking desire, they smothered it, replacing autonomy with submission. These brews were whispered about in darker corners, concoctions that made wives pliant, servants compliant, or rivals weak-willed. If potions of desire were manipulative, potions of control were tyrannical. The recipes reflected this distinction. Potions of desire often used warming herbs, sweeteners, and symbolic ingredients: cinnamon, honey, saffron, rosewater. They were crafted to stimulate, excite, or sweeten. Potions of control, by contrast, leaned on numbing agents and sedatives. Mandrake root, henbane, and opium sometimes found their way into these brews, dulling the senses and clouding the mind. Where one category sought fire, the other sought fog. Socially, the two potions also carried different reputations. Desire potions, while condemned by the church, could still be framed as natural, an attempt to encourage affection that might blossom into marriage or fidelity. They were questionable, yes, but still tethered to the idea of love. Control potions, however, were seen as sinister. They crossed a line from romance into coercion, and though they were whispered about, they were rarely defended. Even Renaissance gossip drew a moral distinction. She gave him a philtre to love her, was scandalous but recognizable. She gave him a drink to enslave him, was monstrous. The irony, of course, is that the line was often blurred in practice. What one person saw as a love potion, another might interpret as a control potion. Did the Duchess want her husband more affectionate or more obedient? Did the young man want genuine affection or compliance disguised as passion? In a world without informed consent, the categories bled together, making romantic intentions sound noble, but often shading into coercion. Gender played a role here too. Potions of desire were most often associated with women, wives, mistresses, or would-be lovers seeking affection. Potions of control were more often attributed to men, who were imagined dosing wives, servants, or rivals to maintain dominance. This was not always true, but the stereotype stuck. In either case, the darker reputation of control potions underscored fears about power imbalance, especially in marriages where women already had limited autonomy. The humor of the situation lies in how people rationalized these categories. Imagine a man defending himself before a magistrate. No, good sir, I didn't enslave her will. I merely inspired her to find me irresistibly charming after drinking my saffron wine. The difference is hair-thin, but the Renaissance was nothing if not full of people drawing hair-thin distinctions when their necks were on the line. The existence of both categories also reveals how love potions weren't just about romance. They were about control of relationships in general. Potions of desire reflected the yearning for affection in a world where marriages were arranged. and choice was limited. Potions of control reflected the harsh reality of hierarchy, where one person's will often had to dominate another's. Both types exposed the deep insecurities of a society trying to manage passion and power in equal measure. We should also note the consequences. Potions of desire might lead to humorous or tragic outcomes. Awkward infatuations, misplaced affections, or the occasional stomachache. Potions of control had more sinister reputations, linked to stories of enslavement, madness, or even death. In some cases, accusations of control potions fueled legal trials, with harsher punishments than those for desire brews. The law recognized, however clumsily, that one was meddling with hearts, while the other meddled with wills. And yet in the secrecy of kitchens and courts, people sought both. The same apothecary might sell saffron wine to one customer, and mandrake-laced cordial to another, depending on what they asked for. Both customers would whisper their orders, both would hope for transformation, and both would walk away with bottles of liquid promises. Whether they wanted love or obedience, the marketplace of potions was ready to oblige. Looking back, it's impossible not to smile at the absurdity. The Renaissance was an age of grand ideals, humanism, beauty, art. Yet in the shadows, people were buying frog powder to make their neighbors swoon and mandrake tea to make their spouses docile. Love and tyranny, bottled together on the same shelf. Ultimately, the story of desire versus control highlights how Renaissance potions were less about herbs and more about anxieties. They reflected the eternal tension between wanting affection freely given and craving the security of dominance. Love, in its pure form, was celebrated in sonnets and paintings. But in kitchens and courts, it was sometimes reduced to the crude question, how do I make them love me? Or worse, how do I make them obey me? For all the talk of frog powder, mandrake roots and pearls dissolved in vinegar, not every Renaissance love potion was pure nonsense. Some ingredients actually did something, just not always what their hopeful drinkers expected. While most potions leaned heavily on symbolism, ritual, or sheer desperation, a surprising number contained herbs and spices with real chemical effects on the body. In other words, science was hiding in there, buried under frog dust. Let's start with alcohol, the simplest and most reliable love potion of them all. Nearly every recipe called for wine, ale, or spiced cordial as a base. Why? Because alcohol lowers inhibitions, warms the body, and makes conversation flow more freely. A nervous young suitor might not have known anything about neurotransmitters, but he certainly knew that his confidence doubled after a goblet of mulled wine. Was it magic? Not really. Was it effective? Absolutely. Even today, the stereotype of liquid courage proves that the Renaissance was onto something, though perhaps they didn't need to add powdered beetles to get the same result. Then there were herbs and spices. Take saffron, for example, highly prized and ruinously expensive. Saffron contains compounds that can elevate mood and increase blood flow. Renaissance apothecaries thought it warmed the humors and inspired passion, and in a roundabout way they were right. Similarly, cinnamon and ginger are mild stimulants that increase circulation and body temperature, effects easily mistaken for the flutter of romance. So when a lady sipped a cup of spiced wine and felt her cheeks flush, she might have attributed it to Venus's blessing, when in fact it was just improved blood flow doing its thing. Honey, another frequent star of recipes, also had a biochemical leg to stand on. Rich in sugars, it delivered quick energy, while its smooth texture and sweetness carried symbolic associations with harmony and affection. Modern science also suggests that honey can influence serotonin levels, contributing to a sense of well-being. The Renaissance didn't know about neurotransmitters, but they knew honey made you feel good, and what's love without a sugar rush? Some ingredients even brushed up against the hormonal system. Fenugreek, occasionally mentioned in herbal texts, contains compounds that mimic estrogen, which might subtly influence mood and libido. Likewise, fennel seeds were thought to stir desire, and modern studies show they contain phytoestrogens. These were accidental brushes with endocrinology, discovered through observation and tradition rather than microscopes. To Renaissance potion makers, fennel warmed the blood. To modern science, it tinkered, albeit gently with hormones. And let's not forget chocolate, which entered European diets in the late Renaissance. Imported from the Americas, cacao was hailed as an exotic stimulant. Aztec rulers like Montezuma were said to drink dozens of cups daily to fuel vigor, both on the battlefield and in the bedroom. Europeans quickly absorbed the idea that chocolate was an aphrodisiac. Modern chemistry backs this up at least partially. Cacao contains theobromine and small amounts of phenylethylamine, which can boost mood and alertness. Add sugar and cinnamon, and you had a potion that tasted as good as it felt. For once, the hype wasn't entirely misplaced. Even some of the more dubious animal-based ingredients weren't entirely inert. Cantharides, or Spanish fly, was notorious as a supposed aphrodisiac. Ground from blister beetles, it caused irritation of the urinary tract, which some mistook for arousal. In reality, it was dangerous and often fatal, but it shows how crude observation could blur the line between genuine physiological response and disaster. Likewise, powdered deer antler was believed to transfer virility, and while that sounds absurd, antlers are rich in collagen and minerals hardly useless, even if they didn't turn the drinker into a Casanova. The humor here lies in how close the Renaissance came to stumbling into real chemistry while still clinging to magic. Imagine an apothecary proudly handing over a potion of honey, cinnamon, and saffron, insisting, "This will inflame her heart with passion." He wasn't wrong. His mixture could indeed raise heart rate and mood. He just skipped over the part where it was physiology, not Cupid, doing the heavy lifting. Or picture a nobleman raving about the wonders of chocolate while his court physician quietly noted, "Yes, it's working, but mostly because it contains caffeine." The Renaissance was flirting with science, even if it didn't know the details. These accidental discoveries remind us that tradition and observation, even without formal experiments, could lead to useful knowledge. People noticed patterns, certain foods energized, others calmed, still others lifted spirits. They didn't have the language of hormones, neurotransmitters, or alkaloids, so they explained it through humors and astrology. But underneath the symbolism, real chemistry was at work. This also explains why some potions endured while others faded into obscurity. The brews that actually did something, wine with spices, chocolate drinks, honeyed infusions, were remembered, copied, and passed down. The ones that did nothing or killed the drinker outright were either quietly abandoned or preserved only as cautionary tales. In this way, trial and error slowly sifted out the more effective potions from the nonsense, nudging folk tradition toward proto-science. From our modern vantage point, it's tempting to laugh at the Renaissance for grinding beetles and boiling sparrow hearts in pursuit of love. But we should also admit they were onto something when they reached for chocolate, honey, or saffron. Their love potions may not have conjured Cupid, but they often did alter mood, body, and perception, exactly the things a lovesick suitor hoped for. Desire may not have been guaranteed, but a little wine and spice never hurt a date night. So yes, science was there all along, disguised in mysticism and muddled by superstition. The Renaissance didn't have the tools to separate chemistry from magic, but they noticed effects and built traditions around them. Love potions worked, not for the reasons people thought, but because biology was quietly sneaking in, spicing the wine and sweetening the honey, while the frog dust fooled everyone. For centuries, love potions simmered in kitchens, apothecary jars, and alchemical flasks, promising passion in every sip. But like many Renaissance fads, their time eventually ran out. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the love potion craze began to wither, overtaken by skepticism, changing science, and a growing Enlightenment belief that human desire was a matter for reason, not rosemary. What had once seemed like powerful filters of passion started to look suspiciously like cups of spiced wine. Eventually, people realized that if a drink makes you woozy, it's just alcohol. The decline began with the slow rise of medicine as science. By the late Renaissance, physicians were starting to poke holes in the old humoral theories that had justified love potions for centuries. Anatomy lessons, dissections, and early chemistry revealed that the body was more complex than four fluids sloshing around. Diseases had causes that weren't just imbalanced bile. and moods had more to do with physiology than planetary alignments. As this more rational framework spread, the idea that parsley or powdered beetles could hijack love seemed increasingly flimsy. The Enlightenment of the 18th century only accelerated the skepticism. Thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot mocked superstition and emphasized reason. If someone claimed to be in love because of a potion, philosophers raised their eyebrows and asked, "Or perhaps you just like the way he looks?" Intellectual salons in Paris chuckled at the idea of enchanted herbs, while scientific societies catalogued plants not for their magical properties but for their chemical ones. Suddenly, saffron was less about stirring passion and more about flavoring risotto. Legal and religious crackdowns had already chipped away at the practice, but Enlightenment culture dealt the final blow by turning ridicule into fashion. To believe too fervently in love potions was to risk sounding old-fashioned, rural, or downright foolish. Urban elites prided themselves on skepticism, dismissing what their grandparents might have whispered over honeyed wine as peasant superstition. And in an age when appearances mattered, no aristocrat wanted to be laughed out of a salon for believing in bottled Cupid. This isn't to say potions vanished overnight. Folk traditions lingered, especially in rural areas. Village healers still passed down recipes for teas and charms, blending old love lore with herbal medicine. But the cultural center of gravity shifted. In courts and cities, filters became less plausible and more laughable. If someone swooned unexpectedly at a ball, gossipers were more likely to blame bad oysters than bewitched wine. The rise of professional medicine also helped kill the trade. Apothecaries, increasingly regulated, were pressured to separate legitimate remedies from quackery. A recipe book that once included both pickling instructions and love filters was now frowned upon. Doctors wanted credibility, and credibility meant distancing themselves from the whisper of sorcery. A physician could still prescribe saffron for melancholy or wine for circulation, but never under the label of love potion. That was too close to witchcraft, and witchcraft was no longer in fashion. Another factor was the growing awareness of placebo effects, though no one called it that yet. Observant doctors and skeptics noticed that people who believed in potions often claimed they worked, even when the mixtures were harmless. This raised uncomfortable questions. Were the potions really doing anything, or was it all in the mind? Once the idea took root, it was hard to look at parsley tea without smirking. Belief, not chemistry, seemed to be the true intoxicant. Humor found its way into the decline too. Satirical plays and pamphlets mocked potion sellers, portraying them as charlatans fleecing gullible lovers. Writers lampooned stories of nobles wasting fortunes on elixirs of passion, only to end up with nothing more than expensive indigestion. In some comedies, potion brewers became stock characters: the shady quack, the desperate lover, the gullible fool. By laughing at them, society signaled it had moved on. Yet the end of the love potion craze wasn't just about reason winning over superstition. It was also about a cultural shift in how people thought about love itself. Renaissance society had framed love as something external, a force that could be manipulated by planets, herbs, or charms. By the Enlightenment, love was increasingly described as an emotion rooted in psychology, character, or even biology. It was messy, unpredictable, and deeply human, but no longer something you could stir into a cup. The mystery of love hadn't disappeared, but it had migrated inward from the apothecary's shelf to the mind and heart. Still, traces of the potion craze linger in subtle ways. We laugh at powdered beetles, but we nod approvingly when someone brings chocolate on a date or pours a lover a glass of wine. Those rituals descend directly from the old filter traditions, stripped of their magical pretenses but carrying the same symbolic weight. The Renaissance may have lost faith in literal potions, but the desire to link food, drink, and passion never really died. By the close of the 18th century, the idea of serious love potions had largely retreated to folklore, remembered with a mix of nostalgia and mockery. Scientific journals stopped mentioning them, courts stopped prosecuting them, and fashionable society stopped pretending to believe. A few rural healers might still have whispered recipes by the fire, but for most, the craze was history. The world had traded frog dust for microscopes, and the old magic was relegated to stories. So the love potion craze fizzled out not with a bang but with a chuckle. Superstition gave way to science, and while people never stopped longing for shortcuts to love, they stopped expecting parsley and saffron to deliver it. The Enlightenment taught them that if a drink made you giddy, it wasn't Cupid, it was the Cabernet. And maybe that was lesson enough. The Renaissance may have ended, but its obsession with bottling passion never really went away. Humanity has always wanted shortcuts to affection, formulas to ignite desire, and guarantees that love or at least lust will show up on cue. The ingredients may have changed, the science may have sharpened, but the dream is the same. From frog powder to pharmaceuticals, humanity's eternal quest to impress on date night continues. Take perfume, for instance. The rosewater and musk of Renaissance apothecaries have given way to shelves lined with glass bottles promising attraction in a spritz. Advertisements don't shy away from the claim, "Spray this, and they'll want you." The science is clearer now. Pheromones are debatable, but scent really does trigger memory, mood, and attraction. Still, the idea is straight out of a 16th century playbook. Dab something fragrant on your body, and suddenly you're irresistible. The deer gland musk may have been swapped for notes of sandalwood, but the principle remains liquid seduction in a vial. Chocolate, once exotic and whispered about in the courts of Spain, is now a global staple of romance. Valentine's Day without it feels incomplete, and every heart-shaped box is a quiet echo of Montezuma's cacao cups. Modern science even backs its reputation. It contains compounds that can boost serotonin and dopamine, improving mood and mimicking the feelings of falling in love. Renaissance nobles may have gawked at chocolate as the secret to passion. Today we just smile knowingly when someone shows up with truffles on a first date. Then there are the pharmaceuticals, the most obvious descendants of love potions. Instead of saffron and honey, modern potions come in the form of tiny blue pills. Viagra and similar drugs promise exactly what Renaissance brews often aimed for: rekindled vigor, restored passion, and a second chance at desire. The difference is that now the ingredients are engineered in labs rather than scraped from beetles. The marketing, however, is the same. Just as an apothecary once assured a nervous courtier, "Drink this and she will notice you," today's commercials promise that swallowing a pill will reignite the spark. Even pop culture keeps the love potion alive. From Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream to Harry Potter's Amartentia, enchanted brews remain irresistible storytelling devices. They let writers explore questions of free will, passion, and folly in exaggerated form. A love potion is funny, tragic, and unsettling all at once. What does it mean to be loved because of a drink? The trope is so enduring because it still reflects our anxieties. Do they love me, or for what I've given them? The Renaissance may have whispered the same question across goblets of saffron wine. The legacy also lingers in everyday rituals of romance. A candle-lit dinner, a shared bottle of wine, a carefully chosen dessert. These are cultural scripts that promise to stir passion, even if we no longer call them potions. Food and drink still play Cupid, just without the frog dust. A Renaissance apothecary would look at a modern date night and nod approvingly. Yes, wine for courage, chocolate for sweetness, and fragrance to seal the deal. Works every time. What's striking is how the balance between science and superstition hasn't really changed. Renaissance potion makers leaned on humors and astrology. We lean on marketing buzzwords and half-understood science. Ads for perfumes claim they're infused with pheromones. Chocolates are sold as mood elevators. Pharmaceutical companies tout breakthroughs while carefully sidestepping the romance of it all. We've replaced whispered charms with clinical trials, but the goal is the same: transforming longing into certainty. The humor of this legacy is hard to miss. Our ancestors believed a man might fall in love after drinking parsley tea under a full moon. Today, people swipe right on dating apps while spritzed with Eros Intense cologne. Different tools, same desperation. The Renaissance suitor muttered spells over honey. The modern one Googles best date night foods to boost libido. Both believe in a recipe for attraction. Both hope chemistry, literal or figurative, will step in when words fail. And perhaps that's why the story of Renaissance love potions still resonates. They remind us that love has always been both terrifyingly unpredictable and hilariously human. No matter how rational the age, people will cling to charms, rituals, and formulas to nudge fate. Sometimes it's parsley in ale. Sometimes it's a glass of Pinot Noir and a spritz of cologne. The packaging changes, but the longing does not. So while no one today is boiling sparrow hearts or grinding pearls into vinegar, thankfully, the Renaissance dream lives on every time someone reaches for chocolate, perfume, or a pill that promises romance. Love, it seems, never stopped being bottled. We just got better at hiding the frog dust.